There is a story buried inside the Harry Potter series that only reveals itself the second time through. The first time, Severus Snape appears cold, menacing, and deliberately cruel. He moves through Hogwarts with his black robes trailing behind him, his voice carrying nothing that could be mistaken for warmth, his eyes watching everything with a quality of contempt that feels practiced and permanent. He docks points from Gryffindor for minor infractions. He reduces students to quiet misery with a single comment. He saves Harry Potter's life in the first book and never mentions it. He seems to despise Harry with a particular intensity that goes past professional grievance into something older and uglier. Then comes the chapter in the Shrieking Shack, then the Pensieve, then a word, always. And suddenly every scene you thought you understood shifts into a different shape. The counter-curse at the Quidditch match, the dungeon classroom confrontations, the failed occlumency lessons, the night on the astronomy tower, the silver doe in a dark forest, the memories pressed into dying hands. Every one of these moments was something other than it appeared. Severus Snape lived two lives at once for over 17 years. One was visible to everyone, a bitter professor with a potions talent and no apparent interest in being liked. The other existed in the dark, known to one person on Earth during most of the years it ran, sustained by a love that had no outlet and a grief that had no end. This is the account of that double life. Every lie he told, every performance he sustained under conditions that would have broken most people, every moment when a single wrong word or an unguarded expression could have unraveled the entire structure and left Harry Potter without the invisible protection he never knew he had. Settle into wherever you are, dear listener. This is a long night story. It starts before Harry Potter was born, in a forgotten industrial town beside a slow and poisoned river, with a boy who learned the value of invisibility before he ever heard the word Hogwarts. He was born in the winter of 1960, in a town that had given up on the idea of improvement sometime around the turn of the century. Cokeworth sat in the north of England with the particular grimness of a place built entirely for industrial purpose and abandoned to its own consequences once the purpose faded. The mills still ran in Snape's childhood, but they ran slower and with less certainty than they once had, and the smoke that came from their chimneys settled over the town in a way that never fully lifted. The river was the colour of old iron. The brick houses that lined Spinner's End were narrow and dark, built so close together that sound travelled between them without difficulty, and privacy was something people performed rather than actually had. The house at the far end of Spinner's End leaned slightly to one side. The front garden had surrendered to weeds years before Severus was born. The windows were small and often dark, and the paint on the door had been peeling for so long that no one inside seemed to notice it anymore. This was the house where Severus Snape grew up. His father was Tobias Snape, a Muggle man. The historical record on Tobias is thin, but the inference from his son's behaviour is not. Tobias occupies most of the textual evidence through implication, the way Severus flinched at certain volumes of sound, the extraordinary vigilance he maintained as an adult, the reflexive stillness he wore in the presence of unpredictable people. Children raised in genuinely safe homes do not develop those habits at that depth. They develop them when the environment of childhood makes the ability to read danger into an art form driven by necessity. What is known directly is that Tobias did not believe in magic, and that this disbelief was not of the tolerant, dismissive variety. It carried contempt. When Eileen Prince's magical nature became undeniable in the context of her son's abilities, the contempt had a target it could not ignore. Eileen Prince is a more complicated figure, and in some ways a more painful one. She had been a Hogwarts student in the 1940s, sorted into Slytherin, and old-school records noted her particular ability in potions. She had been someone, in that other world, before Tobias and the leaning house on Spinner's End. By the time Severus knew her, she moved through rooms as though she was taking up less space than she was entitled to. Her wand stayed hidden most of the time. The magic she had been born with and trained in sat unused, like a language she had promised to stop speaking. Whatever choice or circumstance had brought her to this marriage, and this town, had cost her something she never recovered. Between those two parents, in the narrow space between a man whose anger could fill any room and a woman who had stopped taking up space, grew Severus Snape. He was a watcher from the beginning. He learned very early that the temperature of a room could tell you what was coming before it arrived. He learned which floorboards announced footsteps. He learned the difference between the silence that preceded normal conversation and the silence that preceded something else. He learned to move through his own home in ways that did not draw attention, which is a skill that takes years to develop and reveals everything about the conditions under which it was learned. He also read. The house contained a small number of books from Eileen's former life. Old volumes on spell theory, on the classification of potions ingredients, on the history of wizarding Britain. Severus found them early and worked through them with the focused attention of a child who has discovered that somewhere out there is a world that might have room for him. He read them multiple times. He made notes in the margins in small, precise handwriting. He memorized formulas he had no equipment to practice. By the time he was 9 years old, he knew more about the theoretical structure of magic than many students finishing their first year at Hogwarts. The knowledge was a comfort in the way that knowledge can be a comfort when it is the only form of reliable territory you have. Magic also appeared around him in uninvited ways. Objects shifted position when his emotions spiked. A branch bent without wind as he walked beneath it in a dark mood. Once, during a particularly loud argument between his parents, every window in the house cracked simultaneously along a precise horizontal line, and Tobias Snape went very quiet for the rest of the evening. Severus had not meant to do it. He did not entirely understand what he had done, but he noted, carefully, the effect. This too he filed away. The other children in the streets around Spinner's End found him strange. The worn clothes, the greasy hair that hung over his face like a curtain he had given up drawing back, the quality of his silences, the way he watched rather than participated. Children who are different without being interesting are targets. Children who are different and watchful are targets who make their tormentors vaguely uncomfortable, which usually makes things worse. He was alone in the particular way that children can be alone in a crowd. And then, in the waste ground beyond the end of Spinner's End, near the river where the banks were overgrown with grass that nobody maintained, he found a girl. Lily Evans had red hair and eyes the precise green of glass in an old bottle, and she ran toward things she found interesting rather than away from them, which was a quality Severus Snape had never encountered up close before. She was magic, though she did not yet know what to call it. He had been watching her for weeks before he ever spoke to her, watching from the overgrown bank with the focused attention he gave to anything he wanted to understand. He had seen flowers open when her hand passed over them. He had seen leaves rise from the ground around her feet in slow spirals when she concentrated. He had seen light change quality near her, in ways it did not change near anyone else. She had a sister, Petunia, older by 2 years, and watching with different eyes. Not wonder, not curiosity, but the particular expression of someone who feels something being taken from them before they can name what it is. One afternoon, Lily Evans pushed off a swing at the park and rose from it without coming down the way gravity required. She hung briefly above the seat, hair catching the light, and descended in her own time. She looked startled by herself. Then she looked pleased. Severus stepped out of the grass. He was 9 years old. He told her she was a witch, that he was a wizard, that there was a school where they would both go in 2 years' time, a school where none of the things that made them strange would be strange. He told her this with the particular confidence of someone who has been carrying important information alone for too long and finally has a reason to share it. Lily Evans asked him questions for an hour. Petunia stood at the edge of the park and watched and did not ask any questions, and the expression on her face shifted into something that would eventually harden into a permanent shape. What followed over the next 2 years was a friendship of the kind that forms between children who recognize each other across the ordinary background of everything else. They met at the river, most days when the weather allowed. They talked about magic with the urgency of people who have found the subject that explains them. Severus taught Lily things from his mother's books. Lily absorbed them and noticed things Severus had not thought to notice, which was infuriating and wonderful simultaneously. She was kind in a way that did not feel conditional. This was the thing about Lily Evans that Severus Snape had never encountered before, and would never encounter again, in quite the same form. The kindness was not strategic. It was not offered in exchange for something. She was interested in him, in his thoughts and his knowledge, and the way his mind worked, without apparent awareness that this was unusual, or that anyone might need to earn it. He had never been seen that way. He spent considerable energy in those 2 years, not quite believing it would last. He watched for signs that she would eventually do what everyone else had done, look at the worn clothes and the watchful silences, and the family on Spinner's End, and decide he was not worth the effort. The signs did not appear. She kept showing up at the river. He also spent those years watching Petunia and registering, without fully articulating it, what was happening to her. Petunia wrote a letter to Hogwarts, asking to be admitted. The school replied politely that it could not admit students who were not magical. Lily tried to explain that it had nothing to do with her, that these things were simply given or not given. Petunia found this inadequate as a comfort. The summer before their first year at Hogwarts, Severus was already something he had never been in Cokeworth. Happy, not in the dramatic sense, in the quiet sense of a person who has found that the world contains something worth going toward. He had a friend, he had magic, he had a school to go to. He had no way of knowing yet that the school would divide them, or that his own choices inside it would finish the division, or that the friendship he was about to board a train toward was the thing he would spend the rest of his life trying to repair through the only mechanism left available to him. On the 1st of September 1971, Severus Snape walked onto the Hogwarts Express with the specific alertness of someone who has memorized the itinerary but cannot quite believe the train is real. He knew about the trolley and the prefects and the boats across the lake and the sorting hat. He had read all of it. The knowledge sat in him like a map, and he moved through the stations of the trip, checking each one off with the contained relief of someone who needs the world to match what they have prepared for. The one thing he had not prepared for adequately was James Potter. He opened the wrong compartment door partway through the train ride and found 2 boys inside who were already in the process of becoming something formidable. James Potter, dark-haired and comfortable in his own skin, in a way that broadcast its own authority without effort, and Sirius Black, who looked at Severus across the threshold with the particular expression of someone who has already decided how interesting they find you, and the answer is not very, but also is enough. There were no words that did real damage in that first exchange. The damage was in the quality of the encounter itself. Severus closed the door and found seats elsewhere, but the recognition had already happened. 2 trajectories had come into proximity and registered each other. He sat with Lily for most of the remaining journey, which was the correct choice in every direction. The castle, when it came into view above the lake from the boats, was not what the books had prepared him for. The books described dimensions and architecture, and historical periods, and famous rooms. They did not describe the quality of the light coming from its towers against the Scottish dark, or the way the entire structure seemed to have grown out of the hill rather than been built on it, or the thing that happened to his chest when he saw it for the first time. He had never felt that particular feeling before, the sense of being in the right place. He had never had a right place before. The sorting hat considered him for a long moment after it dropped over his head and spoke to him in the inside of his skull. It found his intelligence immediately, which did not surprise him. It found his ambition, which did not surprise him either. It found the anger underneath both things, and the need underneath the anger, and then it found something it seemed to find interesting, but did not name aloud: Slytherin. Across the great hall, Lily Evans's red hair caught the candlelight as the hat placed her in Gryffindor. She sat down at the Gryffindor table and looked back across the room for him, found him at the Slytherin table, and gave him a smile that contained everything: recognition, affection, the assurance that the distance created by 2 different tables did not change the essential fact of what they were to each other. He carried that smile for years. The Slytherin common room was underground, lit by lamps that gave everything a greenish quality, with windows that looked out through the black water of the lake. It was cold in winter and cool in the months it should have been warm, with a permanent dampness that settled into stone and furniture alike. The boys Severus shared dormitory space with were the sons of families who had been in Slytherin for generations, who wore this history the way other people wore expensive clothes, who discussed blood status with the bored certainty of people revisiting questions they considered settled. They used the word mudblood the way they used other ordinary words, without lowering their voices, without looking around to see who might hear. Severus said nothing about this in those first weeks. He watched, he catalogued. He learned the social structure of the common room with the same methodical attention he had applied to everything else, determining who deferred to whom and why. which hierarchies were enforced and which were performed, what the actual rules of the community were, as opposed to the stated ones. He was good at this. He had been good at it since childhood. He and Lily kept meeting across the house divide. They walked between classes together in the early weeks of term. They studied in the library. They maintained the friendship across a gap that both of them were pretending was smaller than it was. Other students noticed. Some of the Slytherins made remarks. Severus registered the remarks and chose to ignore them, which was itself a statement about how much the friendship meant to him. Ignoring remarks in the Slytherin common room was not costless. In the Slytherin common room, in Severus's second year, there was a circle of older students who gathered near the fire in the evenings and spoke in voices that dropped when staff passed nearby. Their names were Avery and Mulciber, and they were interested in magic that the Hogwarts curriculum did not address, not the ordinary hexes and jinxes that students threw at each other in corridors as a kind of social currency. They were interested in the dark arts with a quality of attention that suggested they had already decided the dark arts were the most serious subject available, and everything else was introductory material. They spoke about a wizard whose name was circulating in certain communities, with a combination of reverence and careful fear. He had been gathering followers since the mid-1960s. He was building towards something that the Ministry of Magic was not yet taking seriously enough. His followers called themselves Death Eaters, which was not a name designed for wide appeal, but was very effective at communicating the seriousness of the commitment required. Severus began listening to these conversations in his second year. His interest in the dark arts was not new. He had been inventing his own spells since before Hogwarts, working on curses and their theoretical underpinnings with the same absorbed interest he brought to potions. He had a particular mind for the structural logic of offensive magic, the way a curse needed to be constructed to produce a specific kind of damage, the relationship between intent and result, the ways that standard defensive magic failed against non-standard attacks. He filled the margins of his textbooks with notes and modifications. He found the restricted section irresistible in ways that had nothing to do with transgression and everything to do with genuine fascination. This was not goodness. It should be stated plainly. The young Severus Snape moving through the corridors of Hogwarts was not a good person waiting to be identified and rescued. He was angry, and the dark arts gave his anger a legitimate vocabulary. He was isolated, and the Slytherin circle gave him something resembling belonging. He was humiliated on a regular basis, and the dark arts community, with its emphasis on power and superiority, offered him a map of a world in which his particular talents would make him somebody. He wanted to be somebody. He had never been given any other reason to believe he could be. At the same time, he was still Lily's friend. This was the structure of his Hogwarts years. The dark circle on one side, Lily Evans on the other, and Severus in the middle, convincing himself these two things could coexist indefinitely. Lily saw what was happening before he admitted it. She watched him spend more time with Avery and Mulciber. She saw the spells he was developing, some of which left marks on other students that went beyond the ordinary damage of student conflicts. She pulled him aside and asked him directly what he thought he was doing. He deflected. He said she did not understand the magic involved. He said the people she was worried about were his friends, and that she was applying Gryffindor standards to a Slytherin context. He said a lot of things that were not the truth. She listened to all of them, and did not believe any of them. James Potter made none of this easier. The Marauders occupied a particular social position at Hogwarts. Enormously popular, genuinely talented, possessed of the casual certainty that the school existed primarily to accommodate their interests. They broke rules and served minor detentions, and continued being liked, which was a form of social impunity that depended on the specific combination of charm and institutional tolerance. Towards Severus Snape, Potter directed a sustained campaign of public degradation that ran through all 7 years of their time at Hogwarts together. The incidents accumulated. Snape levitated upside down in front of an audience, his underwear visible. Snape hexed and then counter-hexed in cycles that made it look like aggression when it was really desperate response. Snape's attempts at dignity picked apart in corridors, where enough people watched to make the humiliation stick. Lily intervened when she saw it. Potter told her it was nothing serious. Potter's obvious interest in Lily Evans gave the whole situation a dimension of additional cruelty that required no deliberate effort from him to maintain. The dark magic circle in the Slytherin common room became, In this context, not just interesting, but necessary. It was the one place Severus Snape was not the person being publicly dismantled for entertainment. He was respected there. His knowledge was taken seriously. His opinions were listened to. The specific texture of that belonging, cheap as it was the only belonging on offer. This is how young people end up in places they cannot easily leave, rarely through a single dramatic choice, usually through a series of small movements toward whatever offers the one thing they most need at the time. He was being offered belonging. He took it. The incident that ended the friendship happened in their 5th year, by the lake, in the warm light of an afternoon in late May. Severus had just finished his ordinary wizarding level examination in defense against the dark arts. 5th year examinations ran over several weeks, and the students who had finished a paper for the day dispersed across the grounds in various states of relief and exhaustion. It was the kind of afternoon that did not feel like it could contain what it was about to contain. Sunny, mild, the lake flat and glittering, the mountains in the distance still holding remnants of late-season snow. Severus sat under a beech tree near the shore and fell asleep, which was the most ordinary thing in the world after a stressful examination. He woke to James Potter and Sirius Black. Potter had decided, apparently on the basis that an afternoon with nothing in particular scheduled was an afternoon that required entertainment, to use Severus as the entertainment. He summoned him with a modified summoning charm variant, lifting him into the air with his wand, and Severus hung upside down over the grass, with his robes falling toward his shoulders, while an audience assembled around them, with the specific enthusiasm people bring to things they are relieved are happening to someone else. What followed lasted perhaps 20 minutes. It involved various degradations, some of which are described in the books, and some of which are implied by the cumulative quality of what Severus spent years afterward being unable to forget. The crowd laughed. Lily Evans was not in the crowd. Then she was. She appeared from the direction of the castle and saw what was happening, and Lily Evans had never, in 7 years, been the kind of person who walked past things happening that should not be happening. She told James Potter to put Snape down. She told him there was no difference between what he was doing and the behavior of the Slytherin students he claimed to despise. She was specific and accurate, and not at all uncertain. Potter put Severus down. Severus, standing on the ground now, in front of an audience, beside the girl whose opinion of him mattered more than any other person's opinion of him had ever mattered, with the precise inventory of his humiliation fresh and complete, said the word. Mudblood. He said it to her. The specific psychological mechanism that produced this particular choice has been discussed extensively. The most honest account is this. The humiliation had accumulated to a point where the only unbearable addition was pity from Lily. Pity from the person he loved was a kind of help he could not survive. So the part of him that had been trained for years in the Slytherin principle of attack before you can be hurt, chose, in that moment, to become the source of the damage rather than its target. She was offering kindness. He made it unnecessary by making himself someone who did not deserve it. The word fell out of him and could not be taken back. She left. He spent the rest of that afternoon and all of the evening waiting outside the Gryffindor common room entrance. She came out eventually, and he spoke. He apologized. He told her he had not meant it. He told her she was his best friend, and he was terrified that this moment would be the thing she carried away from him. She told him she was tired. She told him that she had been watching what he was becoming for years, and had kept hoping it would stop. That the people he was spending time with were not people who would stay for him when he became useful to something else. That the word he had said was not a one-time error, but the word that had been sitting in his vocabulary for years, in the company of people who used it casually, and that it had arrived in his mouth when she showed up to help him. She told him that she could see what he was choosing, and that he was choosing it. She went back inside. He stood there until very late, and then walked back to the dungeons alone. The friendship was over. It would be easy to present this as a tragedy entirely outside his control, a boy pushed into bad company by circumstance and poverty and systematic cruelty, who finally snapped under unbearable pressure. There is truth in that version. The pressures were real. The marauder's treatment of him was real. The limitations of his options, given his background and house placement and family situation, were real. But the word he said was still his word. The circle he had joined was still his choice. Lily Evans had watched him make those choices for years and had kept reaching across the gap, and he had kept taking her hand with one side of himself while walking further away with the other side, until the distance became a contradiction the friendship could not contain. He knew this. He had always known this. That was why the moment by the lake destroyed him as thoroughly as it did, because he understood exactly what had happened, and there was no one to blame for it but himself. If you are settling in for the night with the story of Severus Snape, this is a good moment to mention. If you are new here, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. We release new Law for Sleep videos every week, covering the hidden stories, forgotten characters, and buried histories of the wizarding world. If tonight is your first night joining us, leave a comment below that says Night 1. If you have been listening for a while, tell us how many nights in a row you have fallen asleep with these stories. We love knowing you are out there. Now, back to Severus Snape. After Lily Evans walked away from him for the last time by the lake, Snape made the decision that had been approaching for 3 years. He graduated from Hogwarts. He moved into the wizarding world at large, at a moment when the wizarding world at large was not a comfortable place to be. Voldemort's movement had been building steadily through the early 1970s, and by 1977, it had gone past building into something more active and more dangerous. Muggle families were being attacked. Muggle-born witches and wizards were disappearing. The Ministry of Magic was responding with investigations that ran slowly and found little. Dark magic practitioners who had operated in the shadows were now operating in the open, in their own communities, less careful than they had been, less afraid of being seen. The Death Eaters were a particular kind of organization. They were not a political party with a platform. They were not a revolutionary movement in the ideological sense, despite the language their recruits used. They were a criminal enterprise whose central belief was that magical blood should be protected and purified, and whose methods were entirely unconstrained by the ordinary limits that organizations apply to themselves when they intend to exist for longer than their current leadership. Their recruits were overwhelmingly from the kind of old wizarding families that had spent generations believing their blood gave them something that could be lost through contamination. The sons of those families had attended Hogwarts and been sorted, mostly, into Slytherin, and in the Slytherin common room over the preceding decade, the pipeline from student to Death Eater had been running with increasing efficiency. Avery and Mulciber had already joined. Most of the boys who had constituted the Dark Circle in the Slytherin common room during Snape's years had already joined. The path was not merely visible, it was paved and lit. Snape walked down it. The dark mark was placed on the inner left forearm by Voldemort himself. The ceremony differed in its specifics depending on the source, and no full account from a reliable Death Eater survivor has ever been published. But what is consistent across all testimony is that the moment of taking the mark created something that went past a tattoo. It was a bond. When Voldemort pressed his wand to the mark on any follower's arm, every other Death Eater felt it and came. The mark burned when his power was high, and faded when he was weakened. It was a tracking system and a collar simultaneously, and everyone who took it understood both things. Snape received the mark sometime between 1977 and 1978. What he believed he was doing is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is too easy to retroactively read his choice as either pure evil or as calculated strategy, and it was neither. He was brilliant, and he was angry, and he had spent his formative years being told by the environment he grew up in that he was not much. The Death Eaters disagreed with that assessment. Among Voldemort's inner circle, the capacity for dark arts was not a shameful secret. It was the primary currency of respect. The intelligence and talent Snape possessed, which had been met at school with contempt from his peers and systematic cruelty from the marauders, were valued in this community in direct proportion to their practical use. He was also, by that point, carrying the specific grief of a person who has destroyed the most important relationship of their life through their own actions. Lily was gone from him. What he had done by the lake had been permanent in a way all his apologies could not reach. The loss of her had not made him better. It had made the Dark Circle more available, because the Dark Circle was already there, and Lily was not. He was not calculating. He was not cynical. He was a young man who had found the only community prepared to take him seriously, and had joined it with the partial knowledge and the incomplete moral development that all young people bring to the worst choices they ever make. He worked in Voldemort's service for several years. He attended gatherings. He participated in activities that he would later decline to describe in detail, except to indicate that they were real, and he was not proud of them. He was useful. He was respected. His potions expertise and his knowledge of counter-curses made him an asset in operations that required both. Then, on a particular night in early 1980, he went to the Hogshead Inn in Hogsmeade on a surveillance assignment, and everything changed. The Hogshead was not a pub that encouraged lingering conversations in well-lit corners. It was dim. It smelled of wood smoke and old ale, and something animal that probably had to do with the various creatures the landlord kept in the back, and its clientele came there specifically because they valued a certain quality of inattention from everyone else present. Albus Dumbledore sat in an upstairs room, interviewing a woman named Sybil Trelawney, who had applied for the position of divination professor at Hogwarts. The interview was not going well. Trelawney's manner was eccentric in a way that bordered on theatrical. Her predictions during the course of the conversation had been vague and impressionistic and not particularly impressive. Dumbledore was preparing to decline the position politely. Then her eyes went unfocused. Her voice changed. What came out of her was not her normal voice. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Dumbledore sat very still and listened. Crouched outside the door, listening through the gap, was Severus Snape. He had come on assignment. Voldemort had heard that Dumbledore was meeting with someone at the Hog's Head, and wanted to know why. Snape's role was surveillance. Observe who Dumbledore met. Note anything significant. Report back. He had positioned himself outside the door, in time to hear the beginning of whatever was happening in the room. He heard the prophecy beginning. He heard enough to understand that something was being predicted about a child who would have the power to defeat the Dark Lord. He heard the words about being born to those who had thrice defied Voldemort, born as the 7th month dies. Before the prophecy finished, the landlord, who was Aberforth Dumbledore keeping watch on his brother's meetings, without advertising his relationship to them, found Snape at the door and removed him from the building. He had heard only the first part. He brought what he had to Voldemort. Voldemort received the prophecy fragment with the particular quality of attention he gave to potential threats, which was absolute and without mercy. He worked through the implications quickly. A child with the power to vanquish him, born at the end of July, to parents who had defied him 3 times. 2 children fit the description: Neville Longbottom, born July 30th, and Harry Potter, born July 31. Both had parents who had survived Voldemort's direct attention 3 times. Voldemort chose Harry Potter. He chose the child whose father was a pureblood and whose mother was Muggle-born, the half-blood like himself. He would mark the child who was, in his estimation, most like him. Harry Potter's mother was Lily Evans. The moment Snape understood this, the accounting he had been avoiding for 3 years landed on him all at once. He had carried a piece of a prophecy to Voldemort. The prophecy had identified a target. The target was the child of the woman he had loved since he was 9 years old, the woman he had destroyed his friendship with by choice, the woman who had walked away from him beside the lake and not come back. He had not known, when he brought the prophecy fragment, that the target would be Lily's child. He had not yet processed that Lily was married to James Potter and that they had a son named Harry. The information reached him in stages. First the target, then the identity of the target's parents, then the full weight of what he had done. He went to Voldemort first and begged for Lily's life. He asked Voldemort to spare her, to take the child and leave her alive. Voldemort agreed to this in the casual way that powerful people agree to things they have no intention of honoring, because agreement costs nothing, and compliance can always be revisited later. Snape did not trust this agreement. He went to Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore's office in the castle was full of instruments that turned and clicked in their cases, portraits that watched from their frames with the stillness of people pretending not to listen, and a headmaster who had seen enough of human nature to recognize desperation when it walked through his door. Snape was desperate. He told Dumbledore what he had heard. He told him what Voldemort intended. He told him what he had asked Voldemort and what Voldemort had said. He told Dumbledore he needed Lily Evans and her family to be protected in a way that actually worked, not a way that Voldemort promised and then ignored. Dumbledore listened to all of this with an expression that was not warm, but was not contemptuous either. When Snape finished, Dumbledore asked him what he was prepared to give in return. This was the moment. This was the shape of the bargain that everything else would be built on. Snape told Dumbledore he would give anything. Dumbledore told him what anything meant in practical terms. It meant returning to Voldemort's service while secretly reporting to Dumbledore. It meant becoming a double agent of the most dangerous kind, not someone who works between two organizations with different interests, but someone who lives inside the enemy's operation while feeding intelligence to the opposition. It meant sustaining a performance so complete and so consistent that Voldemort, who was extraordinarily skilled at identifying deception and who had surrounded himself with paranoid and capable people whose job included finding it, would never find a reason to question him. It also meant accepting the longer view. Dumbledore told Snape, in that first conversation, that Voldemort would not be permanently defeated by any single confrontation. He had done things to himself over the years that made death more complicated than it was for ordinary people. Whatever happened in the immediate struggle, there would be an afterward, and in that afterward, Snape's work would likely need to continue. The double life, if it began, would not end quickly. Snape agreed to all of it. He agreed without the benefit of understanding exactly what agreeing meant, because no one can fully understand what they are agreeing to when the thing they are agreeing to is 17 years of sustained deception under conditions that could kill them at any moment. He agreed because the alternative was Lily Evans being left without protection that actually functioned, and that alternative was not survivable for him. Dumbledore said he would try to protect Lily and her family. He said it honestly, which meant acknowledging the limits of what he could promise. Voldemort was already moving. The intelligence work Snape could do might buy time, but could not guarantee outcomes. Dumbledore would try. Snape spent the months that followed in a state of sustained horror that he managed through the only mechanism available to him, the careful control of his external presentation. He was inside Voldemort's organization. He passed intelligence to Dumbledore through channels that could not be traced back to him. He watched the machinery of Voldemort's plan move forward, knowing the intended target, unable to act directly without exposing himself. The Potters went into hiding under the Fidelius charm. The secret keeper was meant to be Sirius Black, a choice that made sense on paper and would later prove catastrophic. At the last moment, James and Lily Potter changed their secret keeper to Peter Pettigrew, believing the switch made them less predictable. Peter Pettigrew was already passing information to Voldemort. The address made its way to the Dark Lord in early November 1981. On October 31st of that year, Voldemort went to Godric's Hollow. Snape was in the north of England when it happened. He did not know until Dumbledore reached him. It was not the news itself that broke him, it was the sequence. First, something terrible had happened in Godric's Hollow. Dumbledore's message was controlled and careful, but the fact that Dumbledore was reaching him at this hour, with this urgency, carried its own information before any specifics arrived. Then, James Potter was dead. Then, Harry Potter was alive. A killing curse had struck the boy and not killed him, which was a thing that had never happened before in the entire recorded history of the killing curse, and whose explanation would occupy Dumbledore's thinking for years. Then, Lily Potter was dead. Snape arrived in Godric's Hollow that night. The house was destroyed. The upper floor had been blown out by the force of Voldemort's attempted murder of the child. The lower floor was accessible through what remained of the front entrance. The Ministry had not yet secured the site. Dumbledore had not yet arrived. He found her. The precise details of what occurred in that room are not described in the published record. Dumbledore alludes to it. Snape never spoke of it directly. What exists is the inference available from the shape of everything that came after, the quality of the change in Snape from that night forward, the completeness of it, the way the grief became structural rather than episodic, built into the foundations of his daily functioning, as though it had always been there. He had not been able to save her. This was the central fact. He had gone to Dumbledore specifically to secure her protection, and that protection had failed. The Fidelius charm had been betrayed from inside. The intelligence he had passed about Voldemort's intentions had been insufficient to prevent the night from happening. More than that, more than the failure of the protection, Voldemort had known where to go because of a prophecy Snape had carried to him. He had not known Lily's child was the target when he did it. He had not been able to foresee the specific chain of events that connected his surveillance report to the destroyed house in Godric's Hollow. These facts were real. They were also irrelevant to what he felt in that room. The accounting Snape ran on himself that night was not interested in mitigating circumstances. He had loved her. He had destroyed the friendship. He had joined the organization that killed her. He had delivered the fragment of prophecy that started the process of identifying her son as a target. The grief that followed this accounting was not the ordinary kind. It was grief compounded by guilt, and guilt compounded by the specific knowledge that the person he was grieving was dead in a sequence he had contributed to. This is the kind of grief that does not diminish with time. It calcifies. It becomes something a person carries inside their ribcage and learns to carry rather than learning to set down, because setting it down would require forgiving yourself, and some things do not feel forgivable. Voldemort fell that night. Whatever had happened when the killing curse struck Harry Potter had rebounded on Voldemort and left him without a body and without most of his power. His Death Eater followers scattered. The wizarding world celebrated. Snape stood before the Wizengamot and claimed that he had acted under Voldemort's imperious curse throughout his time as a Death Eater, that he had been coerced rather than willing. Dumbledore provided testimony in support of this claim. The Wizengamot accepted it. He was cleared. He went to Hogwarts. He began building the part of himself that would carry out the remainder of the bargain. The decade between Voldemort's fall in 1981 and Harry Potter's arrival at Hogwarts in 1991 was, from the outside, unremarkable. Snape taught potions. He was assigned to the position by Dumbledore, who declined to give him defense against the dark arts when he asked for it, with reasons that he gave and did not give simultaneously. He taught in the dungeons below the castle, in a classroom that was cold even in summer, with the particular manner of someone who had decided that warmth in the classroom was not a relevant professional quality. Students learned potions from him, or they did not, and the ones who paid attention and applied themselves learned it well. He was exacting in ways that some experienced as cruel, and others, later in their lives, recognized as the exacting quality of a teacher who actually knew their subject well enough to be disappointed by imprecision. He had very little patience for students who coasted on talent or who believed that effort was optional. He had a lot of patience, concealed under aggressive impatience, for students who were genuinely struggling and trying. This patience was almost never visible. He applied for defense against the dark arts annually. Dumbledore declined annually. This was partly protective. The defense position was cursed, in a way that Dumbledore suspected and later confirmed, to produce a different teacher every year, and placing Snape in it would have removed him from Hogwarts on a yearly cycle that served no one. It was also partly strategic. A former Death Eater who was the defense professor was too visible. A potions professor who happened to have been a Death Eater sat in the background of the school year without drawing attention. Snape understood both reasons and did not press the argument beyond the annual application, which he maintained less out of hope and more out of a habit of registering his preferences for the record. He also maintained his connections to the communities that had surrounded Voldemort's movement, not actively, not operationally, but former Death Eaters were in the wizarding world, cleared or uncleated, and Snape moved among them without flagging his relationship to Dumbledore. When conversations drifted toward the possibility of the Dark Lord's return, he listened. When people expressed opinions about Muggle-born witches and wizards, he did not contradict them. The performance never fully stopped. Dumbledore had been clear from the beginning. Voldemort was not permanently gone. Whatever he had done to extend his existence beyond the ordinary mechanisms of death would eventually reassert itself. When it did, Snape needed to be positioned as someone Voldemort's remaining followers could trust, someone whose record in the First War was credible, and whose decade at Hogwarts could be explained as the strategic maintaining of a cover that would pay off when the Dark Lord returned. This required Snape to be, consistently, and without obvious effort, somewhat worse than he might otherwise have been. He was harder on Gryffindors than the situation required. He was more lenient with Slytherins than a neutral assessment of their behavior warranted. He said things in staff meetings that suggested a lingering sympathy for ideologies he had in fact abandoned, but could not afford to abandon visibly. He was not beloved by his colleagues. He was not trying to be. He also grieved. in the way that people grieve when they have accepted that the grief will not end, which is to say he stopped waiting for it to be over and built his life around and through it instead. His Patronus, when he cast it during the years of this period, took the form of a silver doe. Lily Evans's Patronus had been a doe. The Patronus charm reaches into a person and finds what is happiest and most powerfully positive in their emotional memory, then shapes itself from that material. Snape's happiest and most powerful emotional memory, assessed by the impartial mechanism of the charm, was his love for Lily Evans. The charm produced the shape she had always produced. His Patronus was her Patronus shape, 17 years after he had last spoken to her, as permanent and unchanged as the grief it emerged from. When Dumbledore asked him to see it once, years into this period, and the silver doe moved through the headmaster's office with the silent grace of something made of pure memory, Dumbledore said, "After all this time." Snape said, "Always." He taught potions, he waited, he carried what he carried. The years passed. Then, in September of 1991, he stood at the staff table during the sorting feast and watched a boy with James Potter's face and Lily Evans's eyes walk into the Great Hall for the first time. Snape had known for months that Harry Potter would be coming. He had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, by thinking it through from as many angles as available until the situation was mapped and his responses within it were determined in advance. He knew the boy would have James Potter's black hair. He knew, through the kind of inference available to someone who had looked at Lily Evans every day for 2 years and memorized her face, that there was a reasonable probability the eyes would be hers. He stood at the staff table during the first sorting of the 1991 school year and watched a messy-haired boy walk through the Great Hall doors and understood immediately that he had prepared insufficiently. He had prepared to see James Potter's son. He had not fully prepared to see Lily Evans's son. The eyes were hers, exactly hers, the precise green that he had spent 11 years seeing across a river and across a Hogwarts classroom and across the divide of 2 different house tables. The eyes that had looked at him with genuine and uncomplicated affection for the longest stretch of his life, looking at him now from a face he had spent 7 years cataloguing as a source of contempt, and now had to catalogue differently. He gave Harry the look he gave him. Cold, assessing, unreadable. Harry interpreted this immediately as hostility, which was the correct interpretation on the level available to him, and the wrong one at every level below that. From that moment, the performance had to be complete, and had to remain complete. Voldemort was not gone, and Snape knew Voldemort was not gone with a certainty that went past theoretical into something he could feel at the edge of awareness, a quality of the world that had not returned to its pre-1981 condition and was not going to. When Voldemort came back, and he was coming back, Snape needed to be standing in a position that Voldemort could believe in. Any warmth toward Harry Potter would be noticed, would be reported, would make the position untenable. More than strategy, Snape needed to manage what looking at Harry Potter cost him personally. The boy was a daily reminder of things he could not afford to feel while he was in a classroom, or a staff meeting, or a dinner at the high table. The contempt was partly performance, and partly the only container he had for something that would have been unmanageable without it. The first potions class was calculated. Snape asked Harry questions about subjects not covered in the assigned preparatory reading, not because he expected Harry to know the answers, but because the image of Harry failing publicly to answer questions established the narrative Snape needed. The class that watched was the class that would report. The impression formed in the first lesson would persist and be built upon. Harry was not a special case. Harry was not someone Snape was going to favor. Harry understood this as unfair treatment. It was unfair treatment. It was also the only treatment available. What Snape was actually doing in those first weeks of term, watching Quirrell. Quirinus Quirrell had arrived that year as the defense against the dark arts professor, wearing a purple turban and a quality of nervous energy that was somewhat more extreme than the situation required. Defense professors at Hogwarts were frequently eccentric. They turned over every year for reasons no one had fully identified. Quirrell's particular eccentricity had a texture Snape found concerning in ways he could not yet specify. He watched him at meals. He watched him in staff meetings. He noticed the inconsistencies in Quirrell's explanations for various absences and behavioral irregularities. He noted the way Quirrell's eyes sometimes moved in directions that had nothing to do with what he claimed to be looking at. Something was wrong with Quirrell. He could not yet determine what. There is a scene in Harry Potter's first year at Hogwarts that the series presents one way and means entirely another. During the school's first Quidditch match of the term, Harry is riding above the pitch on a broom that is trying to kill him. The broom bucks, spins, and attempts to dislodge him in ways that go well past rough flying weather into deliberate malice. Down in the stands, Hermione Granger looks through her field glasses and sees Snape sitting in the teachers' section, staring at Harry with his lips moving. She concludes that Snape is hexing the broom. She sets his robes on fire with a small flame from her wand, using the distraction of the crowd cover to do it. The broom stops its dangerous behavior. Harry catches the golden snitch by nearly swallowing it. Gryffindor wins the game. What is actually happening in this scene? Quirrell, sitting several seats away from Snape, is the one hexing the broom. Snape is performing a countercurse. The specific countercurse required to neutralize the hex Quirrell is using has to be maintained continuously, without a single break in concentration, for as long as the hex is active. It is a 7-word incantation repeated in sequence, and any interruption resets it. When Hermione set Snape's robes on fire, she broke his concentration. She interrupted the countercurse. The thing that prevented Harry from falling to his death that afternoon was Snape's continuous, uninterrupted, silent countercurse that Harry believed was the cause of the problem. The thing that nearly killed Harry was Hermione Granger breaking that countercurse with a small fire charm while trying to save him. Hermione Granger, who loved Harry and was trying to protect him, nearly got him killed by stopping the person who was actually protecting him. This is the precise architecture of Snape's first year at Hogwarts with Harry Potter. The appearances required deception. The deception enabled protection. The protection had to remain invisible, because any visible protection would have been reported and analyzed and used against the position that made protection possible. There was also the corridor incident. Snape had discovered, sometime in the autumn term, that someone at Hogwarts was attempting to access the Philosopher's Stone, the powerful object Dumbledore had arranged to have stored in the school under a series of magical protections. Snape's contribution to the protection was a logical puzzle, a row of bottles containing various substances, one of which was the potion needed to pass forward, one of which would send the drinker back, others of which were poison or fire-based. The puzzle required clear thinking and could not be bypassed by magic. He had also been confronting Quirrell. Harry overheard one of these confrontations from the shadows of a corridor and heard it as Snape threatening Quirrell, demanding to know where Quirrell's loyalties lay, implying that Quirrell was making the wrong choices. From Harry's perspective, this was evidence that Snape was attempting to recruit or coerce Quirrell into helping him reach the stone. What was actually happening? Snape was interrogating Quirrell about what he was doing and what he was planning, because Snape had identified Quirrell as the threat to the stone and needed to understand the nature of the threat before he could effectively counter it. Quirrell, at this point, had Lord Voldemort growing from the back of his skull under the turban. He was, in the most literal sense, the enemy inside the building. Snape did not know this specifically. He knew something was wrong with Quirrell, and he was trying to determine what. He was not quite right in the details, but he was entirely right in the substance, and the investigation he was running parallel to his teaching and his performance of hostility toward Harry was the appropriate investigation for the actual situation. At the end of the year, Harry faced Quirrell alone in the chamber beneath the school and destroyed him through a mechanism involving his mother's protection and the nature of the Mirror of Erised. Snape learned afterward what had been present in the school all year. He sat with that knowledge for a long time. Voldemort had been in the building, wearing a professor's face, 12 feet from Harry Potter at mealtimes, for 9 months, and Snape's intelligence, while accurate in its conclusion that Quirrell was the threat, had not identified the true nature of the threat in time to prevent any of it. He did not make the same mistake again about underestimating what Voldemort might be capable of while supposedly powerless. Harry's second year produced a problem that Snape could observe from closer range than most and act on from a greater distance than he wanted. The attacks on Muggle-born students began in September of 1992, and continued through the year in a pattern that frightened the school in cumulative waves. Students were found petrified, rigid and unresponsive, their eyes wide and fixed on nothing. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, Colin Creevey, nearly headless Nick, Justin Finch Fletchley, Hermione Granger. They lay on the stone floors of various corridors with the specific quality of horror that attends life, interrupted without warning. A message appeared on the wall of a second-floor corridor in letters that looked like they had been written in something dark. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. Snape knew what the Chamber of Secrets was. He knew the legend, and he knew enough about the history of Hogwarts to know that legends in that particular building tended to have material origins. He understood what Salazar Slytherin was said to have hidden inside the school, and what sort of creature that legend specified. He also understood what the phrase, heir of Slytherin, meant in historical terms, and what ability a genuine heir would need to possess to command whatever was inside the chamber. That ability was Parseltongue. Harry Potter had demonstrated the ability to speak Parseltongue at the dueling club, in front of the assembled student body, when he appeared to direct a conjured snake toward Justin Finch Fletchley, rather than stunning it as instructed. The school drew its conclusions immediately. The whisper circuit ran through the common rooms within hours. Snape could not publicly defend Harry against the accusation that he was the heir of Slytherin. Such a defense from him would have been, within the context of the performance he was sustaining, inexplicable. Snape defending Harry Potter from accusations of dark wizardry contradicted every quality Snape had constructed in the school over the preceding decade. So Harry walked through his second year, under suspicion from a substantial portion of the student body, while Snape watched and did not intervene in the social damage. What Snape did was investigate. He watched Draco Malfoy with particular attention, because Draco Malfoy was the most likely candidate for genuine involvement. Lucius Malfoy had demonstrated at the start of term that he possessed the kind of arrogance that could lead a man to introduce a dangerous artifact into a school full of children as a method of political maneuvering. Draco had been making pointed comments about the heir of Slytherin since before the attacks started, with a quality of foreknowledge that was suspicious. Snape watched Draco. He watched the attacks. He watched the school's investigation and monitored what Dumbledore was finding and not finding. He did not find the source. The culprit, when Harry and Ron discovered it, was a Horcrux, a fragment of Tom Riddle's 16-year-old self, preserved inside a diary by a piece of magic so dark that the wizarding world's academic literature barely acknowledged its existence. The diary had been placed in Ginny Weasley's possession at the start of term by Lucius Malfoy, who understood what he was doing and had his own reasons for wanting chaos at Hogwarts that year. The diary's version of Tom Riddle had spent the year possessing Ginny and using her to do things she would not have chosen and could not fully remember. Harry killed the basilisk in the chamber with the sword of Gryffindor. Dumbledore expelled Lucius Malfoy from the Board of Governors. Ginny survived. Snape took the information about the Horcrux and what Riddle had apparently been able to do with his own soul and gave it to Dumbledore. This piece of information would sit in Dumbledore's thinking and eventually become the foundation of the most important plan either of them would make together, but that was years away. In 1992, it was simply one more piece of evidence that what they were dealing with when they dealt with Voldemort was not an ordinary dark wizard with ordinary ambitions and ordinary vulnerabilities. Remus Lupin arrived at Hogwarts in September of 1993, and Snape spent the better part of the school year demonstrating that the past does not loosen its grip without a fight. Lupin had been appointed Defense Against the Dark Arts professor and arrived at the station looking tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the journey and everything to do with the specific brand of exhaustion that comes from years of managing a condition that most of the wizarding world would prefer not to acknowledge. He was gentle with the students. He was patient in a way that Snape's teaching style specifically was not. The students adored him within the first month. The history between them was not complicated. It was ancient and specific and had not faded. Snape brewed the wolfsbane potion that kept Lupin's werewolf form manageable during the full moon, which was a contribution requiring considerable expertise, and without which Lupin could not have functioned safely at the school. He did this because Dumbledore asked him to, and because the potion was within his capabilities, and because refusing would have been a pointlessly cruel denial of something a person needed to function. He also went out of his way to make Lupin's professional life more difficult, wherever he found an opportunity to do so, without crossing into insubordination. He taught a substitute class for Lupin's students on werewolves, a subject that happened to be right at the intersection of what was medically true and what would lead attentive students to certain conclusions about their defense professor. He did not apologize for this. He was not going to apologize for this. The marauders had done what they had done, and the fact that it was 20 years ago did not change what it was. But third year also produced a night in May that tangled personal grievance with professional complexity in a way that makes it impossible to read Snape's behavior in it as entirely one thing. Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban, the first person in the prison's history to manage it. The wizarding world understood Sirius to be the man who had betrayed the Potters to Voldemort and then murdered 12 Muggles and Peter Pettigrew on a public street with a single curse. He was considered extremely dangerous. The Dementors who guarded Azkaban were deployed at Hogwarts to search for him. Snape spent the year tracking Sirius's movements and watching for evidence of what he was doing at the school. What he discovered, late in the year, was that Sirius had been in contact with someone inside the castle. He discovered the passage through the Whomping Willow. On the night in May when Harry, Ron, and Hermione followed a large black dog into the tunnel and came out in the Shrieking Shack, Snape arrived shortly after Lupin. He had heard none of the conversation that preceded his entrance. In the Shrieking Shack, the full truth of 1981 was coming out. Pettigrew was the traitor, Sirius was innocent, and Pettigrew had been hiding for 12 years, in his animagus form, as Ron's rat. Snape walked into the room after this accounting had already begun, and comprehended none of it, because he had not been present for any of it. He saw Sirius Black. He saw Lupin. He saw Harry, Ron, and Hermione. He bound the adults with magic. What Snape felt in that moment was not one thing. He felt the professional certainty that Sirius Black was a wanted criminal who should be returned to ministry custody, and that Lupin had been, apparently, complicit in hiding Black's access to the school. He felt the old hatred activated by the specific presence of the man he had believed for 12 years was the person who sold the Potters to Voldemort. He felt Harry's presence in this scene in a way that complicated everything, because Harry was James Potter's son, and James Potter was the reason Snape had spent 7 years of school being publicly dismantled, and Sirius had helped with that, and everything in Snape's history, with this specific set of people, was making objective assessment extremely difficult. Harry disarmed him, let Sirius and Lupin escape. Sirius left on a hippogriff. Lupin resigned the next morning, when his condition was revealed by Snape's substitute lesson. Snape was furious, in ways that were real and justified, and also went past what the immediate situation warranted, into territory the old wounds had been waiting to reach. He did not act directly against Harry. He reported to Dumbledore with a level of outrage that was genuine, and also not entirely proportionate. But Harry was still alive, and still at Hogwarts when September came again. Fourth year began, for Snape, with the dark mark burning faintly on his arm for the first time in 13 years. The burn was not the full activation that came when Voldemort pressed his wand to a follower's mark and summoned them. It was something less than that, and more than nothing, a reawakening, a signal that whatever had been dormant in the mark since Voldemort's fall in 1981 was stirring back toward consciousness. Snape registered it and went to Dumbledore immediately. The specific trigger was the dark mark fired over the Quidditch World Cup campsite in August, cast by a Death Eater who was drunk on the nostalgia of old power and the entertainment of several 100,000 people's fear. The Ministry response was chaotic. The message sent through the wizarding world was clear. Those people still existed, and they were not as quiet as they had been. Snape spent the weeks between August and September watching the quality of conversations in the communities he monitored and noting a specific shift. The former Death Eaters, who had spent 13 years doing the careful work of not being too obviously former Death Eaters, were talking differently. The possibility of the Dark Lord's return had moved from speculation to something closer to anticipation. At Hogwarts that September, Alastor Moody arrived as the new defense against the dark arts professor and brought with him a magical eye, a wooden leg, a flask of polyjuice potion he drank from regularly, and something Snape found immediately concerning. The concern was specific. Snape had spent years among people who were performing acceptable versions of themselves for audiences that would have been dangerous if they knew the truth. He had observed that performance at close range had in fact been one of those performers, and the experience had given him a sensitivity to it that was accurate in ways he could not always fully articulate. What he felt around Moody was the specific quality of someone performing, not performing nervousness, not performing the post-trauma vigilance that Moody was known for, but performing Moody. The details were right, but the logic underlying them was wrong in ways that only became visible if you were watching for it. He raised this with Dumbledore. Dumbledore listened and did not immediately act, because the evidence available was insufficient for action, and because Dumbledore's own assessment of the situation was still forming. The Triwizard Tournament provided Moody with a mechanism. The Goblet of Fire selected 3 champions for the dangerous inter-school competition, one from each of the 3 participating schools. It selected Harry Potter as a 4th champion, which was impossible on the standard rules of the competition, and which no one present could explain. Moody argued, correctly, that the goblet constituted a binding magical contract, and Harry had to compete. Harry competed and survived all 3 tasks, partly through his own ability, and partly through advice and assistance he received from Moody over the course of the year, advice that was specifically calibrated to get Harry to the end of the maze. The Triwizard Cup inside the maze was a portkey. It took Harry to a graveyard in Little Hangleton. Cedric Diggory was killed with Avada Kedavra the moment they arrived. Peter Pettigrew performed a resurrection ritual using Harry's blood and Voldemort's bone, and Pettigrew's own severed hand. Voldemort had a body. He pressed his wand to Pettigrew's dark mark. In his office at Hogwarts, Snape looked down at his left arm. The mark burned fully dark and hot for the first time in 13 years. He went to Dumbledore's office and showed him the mark and asked him directly what Dumbledore wanted him to do. Dumbledore said clearly what he wanted. Snape was to return to Voldemort's inner circle. He was to appear at Voldemort's gathering with an explanation for his 13-year absence that Voldemort would accept, and he was to resume the intelligence operation that had run through the First War. Snape went. The explanation he offered Voldemort for 13 years of apparent absence was the one he and Dumbledore had designed together. He had spent those years maintaining his cover at Hogwarts, close to the one person Voldemort had most reason to want intelligence about, waiting for the Dark Lord's return and preparing for when it came. This explanation was simultaneously true and false in the precise proportion that makes a good cover story. Every individual fact was accurate, and the pattern they were arranged into described a loyalty Snape did not possess. Voldemort accepted him back. Snape was inside again. The Order of the Phoenix reconvened at 12 Grimmauld Place in London in the summer of 1995, and Severus Snape attended its meetings as one of its members. The house on Grimmauld Place was the ancestral property of the Black family, a townhouse in a grimy London square that had been kept from Muggle perception by generations of enchantment. Sirius Black, legally innocent since 3rd year, but officially still a wanted criminal in the Wizarding World's paperwork, was confined there by Dumbledore's instruction while the Ministry processed the return of Voldemort at its customary pace of denial. The Order's membership included people who had fought in the First War and carried the specific memories that came with having fought in it. Some had lost people to Death Eaters, some had been tortured by Death Eaters. Nearly all of them knew what Snape had been and who had vouched for him, and most of them found the arithmetic of this either uncomfortable to sit with or actively enraging. Sirius Black found it enraging. The two of them shared the particular kind of history that cannot be filed under simple categories. Snape hated Sirius Black for things Sirius Black had actually done, including a specific incident in 5th year in which Sirius had sent Snape down a tunnel in the Whomping Willow, specifically so that Snape would encounter the transformed werewolf Lupin at the other end, in what would have been a fatal mauling if James Potter had not pulled Snape back. Sirius found Snape contemptible for reasons that combined the original contempt of adolescent social hierarchy with genuine concern about having a former Death Eater at Order meetings. Neither of them was entirely wrong. Neither of them was being anything resembling strategic about it. Dumbledore required them both to function in the same organization, and they did, with evident difficulty. What Snape contributed to the Order was intelligence. He attended Voldemort's gatherings. He reported on plans, on personnel, on targets, on the direction and nature of what Voldemort was building. The intelligence had to be managed carefully, which is a limitation intrinsic to the position. An agent can only pass what they can pass, without making themselves the obvious source. Every piece of information Snape gave the Order was a calculation. If this specific piece reaches Dumbledore, and Dumbledore acts on it, can Voldemort trace the action back to a specific informant? And if so, am I the only person who knew this? Some information was passable, some was not. The things he could not pass accumulated into a kind of additional weight he carried alongside everything else. The year also brought the occlumency problem. Voldemort had realized that his connection to Harry through the scar went in both directions, and had begun exploiting it. Harry was receiving visions and emotional impressions through the connection that were partly accurate and partly the beginnings of deliberate manipulation. Dumbledore determined that Harry needed to learn to close his mind against this intrusion. The natural teacher for this subject was the person at Hogwarts with the most direct knowledge of mental defense against dark magical intrusion. That person was Snape. The lessons were scheduled for the evenings in Snape's office, and the expectation was that the lessons would work if both parties applied themselves. The lessons did not work. Occlumency is not what most people imagine it to be when they first hear about it. The popular conception of a mental defense involves building walls, constructing barriers, placing things behind protections that cannot be breached. This is the wrong model. Walls can be found, protections can be identified and dismantled. A wall suggests something behind it worth hiding, and a skilled legilimens will follow that suggestion directly. Genuine occlumency works differently. It works by clearing. An occlumens does not fortify their memories. They vacate the room those memories are in. They achieve a quality of mental stillness so complete that a legilimens entering the mind finds nothing to catch onto, no texture of emotion or memory that offers purchase. The practice requires a specific kind of emotional discipline, the ability to feel nothing, or more accurately, to suspend feeling so thoroughly that it leaves no trace in the mind's surface. Harry Potter in Snape's office was incapable of this. Harry brought to every lesson the full weight of what Snape's behavior had cost him over 4 years of school. He came angry, he came defensive, he came with his emotions active and near the surface, and his memories of grievance and injustice readily available in the exact configuration that legilimency was most effective at accessing. He was, from the perspective of occlumency training, a wide-open door with a welcome mat. He also came without understanding why the lessons were happening, because Dumbledore had not explained to Harry the full nature of the Voldemort connection, or the specific risk that came with it being left open. Harry knew he needed the lessons, but did not have the frame to understand what the lessons were protecting against, and motivation matters enormously when the practice requires this particular kind of disciplined self-control. Snape could have explained this. He could have sat down with Harry and explained the mechanics and the stakes, and the precise reason why Harry's emotional state at the beginning of each session made everything harder. He did not do this. He arrived at each lesson with his own emotional state regarding Harry Potter, James Potter, and the general accumulated difficulty of his position, and he began each lesson with the kind of pointed comment that confirmed Harry's existing assessment of him. The lessons became confrontational before they became instructional. Harry could not learn occlumency in this atmosphere. Snape could not teach it well in this atmosphere. Both of them were failing at the task through the specific mechanisms most available to them, given their histories with each other. In the one lesson where Harry successfully pushed back against Snape's legilimency intrusion, the force of his rebound was strong enough to send a stream of Snape's own memories briefly into Harry's awareness. Harry saw pieces of a childhood and a past that he had no way to read. A hook-nosed boy on a filthy street, a woman with curtained hair moving through a small house, a red-haired girl laughing on a train. He did not understand what he was seeing. He did not have the context to read it. But he saw it, and Snape saw him seeing it, and Snape terminated the lesson immediately and told Harry to get out. He sat alone in his office after Harry left for a period he could not quite account for afterward. The lessons resumed. They did not improve. Snape eventually suspended them, citing Harry's unwillingness to practice sufficiently between sessions, which was accurate but was not the entire accounting. Without occlumency functioning, the connection between Harry's mind and Voldemort's stayed open. In May of that year, Voldemort sent Harry a false vision. Sirius Black being tortured in the Department of Mysteries, the vision so vivid and so urgent that Harry did not question it. Harry and 5 of his friends travelled to the Ministry of Magic in the middle of the night. The ambush waiting for them nearly killed all of them. Sirius Black came to their rescue and was killed by his cousin Bellatrix Lestrange while he was doing it. If the occlumency had worked, Harry would not have received the false vision, the ambush would not have been triggered, Sirius would not have come to the Ministry. He would still have been alive. Snape knew this. Dumbledore knew this. The knowledge did not change anything about what had already happened, but it added to the weight both men carried, the specific heaviness of failures that occurred because the mechanism designed to prevent them had not been made to work. We are now, dear listener, at the midpoint of Severus Snape's story. If you have been with us since the beginning tonight, this is a wonderful moment to leave a comment below. Tell us what you think of Snape so far, whether you find his story more complicated now than when you started. Every comment lets us know you are out there in the dark with us. If you have already drifted off to sleep, we hope the story is still reaching you. Now, the second half of the double life continues. In Harry's 6th year, he used a second-hand potions textbook that turned out to be something much more than a textbook. The copy of advanced potion making he collected from the school's stores was an old one, its cover worn, and its pages soft with use, and its previous owner had clearly regarded the official printed text as a starting point, rather than an authority. Large sections had been crossed out and replaced with handwritten alternatives in small, precise script. Lengthy annotations appeared in the margins beside every significant process. The modifications were not decorative or speculative. They were the notes of someone who had worked through these methods in practice and found specific ways to improve them. The official method for Draught of Living Death, for example, involved a series of steps designed to produce a consistent result with an acceptable margin of error. The previous owner had crossed out 2 of those steps entirely and added a note suggesting that adding the saprophyros bean after crushing, rather than cutting it, released compounds that substantially enhanced the potion's effectiveness, and that stirring should be done counterclockwise, at specific intervals, rather than following the printed direction. The correction produced, in practice, a result that was dramatically better than the textbook method. Harry followed the marginal notes throughout the 6th year and produced the best potions work of his life. Horace Slughorn, who had returned to Hogwarts to teach the subject, was greatly impressed and lavished Harry with attention he had not been prepared to offer before seeing what Harry could apparently do in a potions classroom. It should be said plainly, Harry was not producing that work. The previous owner of the book was. The previous owner had also been developing spells, not in the way potions notes develop over time through accumulated corrections to a printed text, but genuinely invented spells written into the book's blank pages, complete with wand movements, incantation structures, and notes on the theoretical principles underlying each one. Some were practical utility spells with no existing counterpart. Some were jinxes of the moderately unpleasant variety. Some were of a more serious category. One entry on a blank page read only the incantation Sectum Sempra, and beneath it the annotation for enemies. The word described the spell's purpose accurately. Sectum Sempra was a curse that cut, not a slicing hex of the kind used in standard dueling, which caused superficial wounds that closed cleanly. Sectum Sempra was something considerably more severe, a spell that produced deep and ragged lacerations that would not stop bleeding without the specific countercurse the same inventor had created to reverse it. The book was signed on its inside cover, "This book is the property of the Half-Blood Prince." Harry spent much of the year trying to identify the previous owner. The signature suggested either a very unusual first name or a pseudonym built from a surname. Harry ran through possibilities, consulted other students, researched historical records, and did not arrive at the answer through any of these routes. The answer arrived at the end of the year, in a confrontation on the Hogwarts grounds, when Snape told him directly. The Half-Blood Prince was Snape. The surname Prince came from his mother, Eileen Prince, which made him half Muggle and half magical, and the title he had constructed for himself was built from both halves of that dual origin, the Muggle blood acknowledged in the half, the magical heritage claimed in the Prince. He had built himself a private identity in the margins of a schoolbook, an alternative to the self that the Slytherin common room was constructing for him in those same years. The annotations in the margins were his intellectual history written down. The improvements to the standard methods were what happened when genuine potions talent, applied with real independent thinking, went to work on a curriculum that had been teaching the same methods for decades, without asking whether they were the best ones available. Snape in 6th year at Hogwarts was not a good person in any simple sense, but he was a genuinely extraordinary potions mind, and the book documented it. The invented spells were something else. They were what happened when that same mind was 17 years old and had spent years being systematically humiliated and had found that anger was more consistently available to him than most other emotional states. Sectum Sempra did not come from a person who was doing well. It came from a person who had been made to feel small enough and often enough that the imagined capacity to cause damage had become a form of psychological relief. Harry used Sectum Sempra on Draco Malfoy in a 6th floor bathroom without knowing what the spell did. He knew the annotation said for enemies and had filed it away under the assumption that it was something extreme, but something he would understand the nature of when he used it. Draco Malfoy nearly died on the bathroom floor. The wounds Sectum Sempra opened would not close on their own. Snape arrived within minutes, which was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence that he had been monitoring Draco Malfoy that year with close enough attention to know when something catastrophic had happened to him. He knelt on the wet floor of the bathroom and performed the counter curse, a specific healing incantation he had created alongside the original curse, and the wounds that Harry had opened Snape spent several minutes closing. He looked at Harry when it was done. He said nothing about the book. He said nothing about the fact that Harry had obtained and used a spell from a source Snape would have recognized immediately. He gave Harry detention and dismissed him. Harry understood later, after everything else was over and the full picture was available, what that moment in the bathroom had contained. It was one of many moments in which Snape found himself repairing damage caused by the 17-year-old version of himself, using the tools the 17-year-old version of himself had created for exactly that purpose. He had made Sectum Sempra. He had also made its cure. He had been doing this kind of accounting his whole adult life. In the summer before Harry's 6th year, on a night in late June, 2 women arrived at Snape's house on Spinner's End. He let them in. The house on Spinner's End had not changed much since his childhood. He had lived there during school holidays and after Hogwarts, and it still had the narrow rooms and the worn furniture and the quality of a place that had absorbed many years of unhappiness and found a way to persist through it. The shelves that had held his mother's magical texts now held his own, floor to ceiling on every wall of the sitting room, and the books were marked and annotated the way they had always been, every margin in use. Narcissa Malfoy was composed in the way that people are composed, when the effort of composure is enormous, and the alternative is not acceptable to them. She had Draco's pale colouring and the Malfoy posture that was itself a form of armour, and she sat down across from Snape and told him what had happened. Voldemort had assigned Draco a task. The task was to kill Albus Dumbledore. The framing Voldemort had used was one of honour and privilege, the opportunity to accomplish something that would cement the Malfoy family's standing with the Dark Lord after the events of the previous year, during which Lucius had failed him, and the entire family had suffered for it. The opportunity to restore the name, the chance to make Voldemort's enemies understand what the Malfoys were capable of. Narcissa Malfoy was not fooled by this framing. Voldemort had assigned this task to Draco because Voldemort expected Draco to fail. Dumbledore was the most powerful wizard alive, with 60 years of defense experience and resources Draco could not begin to match. A 16-year-old boy with no combat history and considerable fear making an attempt on Dumbledore's life was going to fail, and when he failed, Voldemort would punish the Malfoy family for the failure. This was not a second chance. This was a slow execution of the Malfoys, by means of their son's inevitable defeat. Narcissa wanted Snape to protect Draco, to watch over him, to assist him if he could, and, if Draco reached the moment of the task and could not complete it, to complete it in his place. Bellatrix Lestrange had accompanied Narcissa and stood watching this conversation with an expression of unconcealed suspicion that she had worn consistently around Snape for years. Bellatrix was the kind of true believer who had never stopped finding Snape's survival implausible. She had never trusted him. She found his explanations too convenient, his record too clean, his access to Dumbledore too cozy for someone who was supposed to be working against him. She challenged him directly, and at length, with the specific challenges she had been accumulating for years. Why had he stayed at Hogwarts all this time? Why had he not returned to Voldemort sooner, when the signs of the Dark Lord's return had been apparent for years? Why had the Order of the Phoenix not been undermined more effectively if he was inside it? Why did he always seem to be in the right position to benefit from whatever happened, without his position having cost him anything visible? Snape answered each of these challenges with patience and specificity. He explained the Hogwarts assignment as the most valuable intelligence position available: access to Dumbledore, access to Harry Potter, access to the Order of the Phoenix's meetings and planning. He explained his return to Voldemort's side after the Dark Lord's resurrection as the precise moment it made sense to return, not before, because returning earlier would have looked suspicious given his position at the school. He explained the Order's failures as the result of information he fed them that was accurate but strategically useless, and the useful information he had withheld. Every answer was the truth rearranged into a false pattern. Bellatrix was not satisfied, but she was not the one who had come here desperate. Narcissa asked him to make an unbreakable vow. The unbreakable vow is a magical commitment performed in a ceremony involving two participants, a binder, and the physical joining of hands. Its terms are established through question and answer. As the terms are agreed, fire braids itself around the joined hands, and the bond is sealed. Both parties are bound to the terms. If either of them breaks those terms, they die. The magic is not metaphorical. It is not conditional. It does not have exceptions. Snape agreed to the vow. Bellatrix served as the binder because no one else was present, and the ceremony required one. The terms: that Snape would watch over Draco and protect him as he could, that Snape would help Draco in the carrying out of the task given him by the Dark Lord, and that if the moment came when Draco was unable to complete the task, Snape would carry it out in his place. Bellatrix looked at Snape across their joined hands during the ceremony, with an expression that said she believed she was watching him commit to his own destruction. If the terms required him to kill Dumbledore, she believed, then he was either making a vow he could not keep, which would kill him, or making a vow that revealed he had always intended to serve Voldemort, and was now cornered into proving it. Neither outcome seemed to trouble her. The fire braided, the vow was sealed. Snape went to Dumbledore the next day, and told him what he had agreed to. Dumbledore listened to all of it without immediate response, and then he told Snape that he was not, as it happened, surprised. He had been expecting Voldemort to use Draco this way. He had been thinking about the implications of it for some time, and what Snape had agreed to in the vow, Dumbledore told him, fit a plan that Dumbledore had already been forming for an entirely different reason. The plan had to do with Dumbledore's right hand, which was blackened to the wrist, and the ring he had found in the gaunt shack at the beginning of the summer, and the curse inside that ring that Dumbledore had not been fast enough to avoid when he destroyed it. Dumbledore was dying. He had been dying since June. The curse from the ring was spreading through his body at a rate the school's medic had been able to slow but not stop. He had perhaps a year from the time of the curse's initial spread. Snape had known about the hand, had in fact treated it at the beginning of the school year, but had not yet understood the full implications of what the treatment's limitations meant. He understood now. Dumbledore told him what he wanted. Albus Dumbledore had been dying for longer than most people in the school knew, and he had been thinking about how to use that fact for nearly as long as he had known it. Snape had treated the blackened hand at the beginning of the school year, in the first days of September, when Dumbledore arrived in his office, with his right arm shriveled to the wrist, as though something inside the tissue had burned out the life from within. The wound was a curse, and not a minor one. It was the residue of a dark object's protection, responding to an attempt to destroy it, the kind of counter-mechanism that old dark magic put in place to punish whoever managed to get close enough to do damage. Snape had slowed the spread with everything available to him. He had bought Dumbledore time. He had not been able to stop what was happening. The curse was moving through Dumbledore's body. Without intervention, it would reach his heart within a year, possibly less. The intervention available was the same Snape had already applied: further delay, slowing the spread, buying weeks where months had been the question, and then months where the original estimate had been a year. In the end, Dumbledore would be dead. He had told Snape this clearly, at the beginning of the school year, when the nature of the wound was fully understood between them. He had framed it not as a tragedy, but as a logistical fact that needed to be incorporated into planning. He had already begun thinking about how his death could be used. The plan Dumbledore presented to Snape in the weeks after the vow was not a plan Snape found easy to accept. Dumbledore explained it in stages, with the particular quality of patience he brought to things he understood to be genuinely upsetting and did not wish to rush past inappropriately. He told Snape about the Horcruxes, the 7 pieces of Voldemort's soul that Voldemort had divided himself among various objects and people, ensuring that so long as any piece of soul survived, Voldemort could not be permanently killed. He told Snape that he had been working for years on identifying and destroying these objects, and that when all of them were gone, there would be a final confrontation between Voldemort and the one person the prophecy had designated, and that person was Harry Potter. He told Snape something else, something that required Snape to sit with it for a long time before he could speak again. Harry Potter was himself a Horcrux. Not deliberately, not by Voldemort's design, but by accident. On the night of October 31st, 1981, when Voldemort's killing curse struck an infant and rebounded, the sheer violence of the magical event had shattered Voldemort's already damaged and divided soul one more time, and a fragment of that soul had attached itself to the nearest living thing. The nearest living thing was Harry Potter. He had carried a piece of Voldemort inside him since he was 15 months old, without knowing it, without anyone knowing it until Dumbledore worked it out from the evidence available to him over many years. This meant that the final confrontation between Harry and Voldemort, the one the prophecy described, could not simply end with Voldemort's death. For Voldemort to be fully and permanently dead, the piece of his soul inside Harry would have to be destroyed first. And for that piece of soul to be destroyed, Harry would have to die, or at least appear to die, or at least die in the technical sense of going far enough toward death that the Horcrux attached to his soul could be eliminated by the force of the killing curse. Dumbledore told Snape that he had reason to believe Harry might survive this if it happened voluntarily, if Harry went to his death knowing what was needed. The protection Lily had placed on Harry through her sacrifice, the ancient magic of willing death on behalf of love, had done something to Harry's soul, and to the bond between Harry and Voldemort, that Dumbledore believed could, if the mechanics of the final confrontation were right, allow Harry to survive even the killing curse a second time. Dumbledore told Snape this was not certain. He told Snape he believed it. He told Snape that Harry could not know this until the time came to act on it, because Harry needed to have lived fully and fought genuinely, and built the capacity for the willing sacrifice that the plan required. He could not be told he was a Horcrux in 5th year, and then spend 2 more years functioning under that knowledge. The information had to wait. And Snape's job, for the time being, and for however long it took, was to protect Harry, to protect him and educate him when possible, and ensure that he reached the final confrontation in a condition to make the choice the plan required. And then, Dumbledore said, Snape would have to tell him what to do. Snape looked at Dumbledore across the desk and told him that he was raising Harry like a pig for slaughter. Dumbledore did not deny this. Snape asked him if he had ever, in any of this planning, considered what it cost to love someone you were also planning to send to their death. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. He told Snape that this was why he had told him, because Snape would tell Harry what he needed to know at the right moment, and because only someone who loved Harry would manage that specific task with the necessary care. He also told Snape what was needed in the immediate term, which was, Snape's death had to serve the plan's purposes, and in order to die usefully, Dumbledore needed to die at Snape's hand. When Draco reached the tower with the Death Eaters, he was planning to bring into the school, and when Draco failed to kill Dumbledore, as Dumbledore was confident he would fail, Snape needed to arrive and complete the action himself. He needed Snape to say the words. Snape told Dumbledore that this was too much to ask, that killing him was not something he was willing to add to the list of things he carried. Dumbledore told him that the alternative was Draco Malfoy killing him, which would damage a 16-year-old boy's soul irreparably, or Fenrir Greyback killing him, which would be painful and would benefit no one, or the curse in his arm reaching his heart within the next few months anyway. He was dying. The question was not whether but how, and whose position was served by the how. Snape's position, if Snape was the one who killed Dumbledore, would be cemented with Voldemort beyond any doubt. He would be trusted completely. He would be appointed to positions of genuine power. he would be able to protect Harry from inside Voldemort's inner circle in the year to come, in ways that would be impossible if his position remained ambiguous. It had to be him. Snape sat with this for a long time. He agreed. On the night of June 30th, 1997, on the astronomy tower, at the top of the highest point of Hogwarts Castle, Draco Malfoy cornered Albus Dumbledore with a wand and an expression of genuine terror beneath the surface of his attempt at menace, and could not kill him. The Death Eaters he had brought into the school arrived on the tower. Fenrir Greyback was among them. The impatience in the air was a physical quality. Draco was running out of time. Snape arrived on the tower. He had been watching Draco all year. He had been waiting for this specific moment. The moment Draco reached the edge of the thing Voldemort had sent him to do, and found he could not go over it. Because Draco was going to find exactly that. Because Draco Malfoy was many things, including cruel and entitled and susceptible to his father's worst qualities. But he was not someone who could kill an unarmed elderly man in cold blood on a dark tower while people watched. Snape looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back at him, with the expression Snape had been dreading, and also the only expression that could have given him what he needed to proceed. Not terror, not desperation, not an appeal to sentiment. Pleading, clear and specific. Not the pleading of a man who wants to be saved, but the pleading of a man who needs the person in front of him to understand what matters, and to keep holding it after he is gone. Snape understood. Avada Kedavra. Dumbledore fell from the tower. Snape collected Draco and left the school with the Death Eaters. When Harry, who had been beneath the tower throughout all of it under a Petrificus charm Dumbledore had silently cast to prevent him from intervening, came after them across the Hogwarts grounds in a state of fury and grief, Snape blocked every spell Harry threw without returning a single offensive curse. He deflected, he redirected, he kept himself between Harry and the Death Eaters in ways that looked like simple tactical movement and were in fact a very specific kind of protection. Harry called him a coward on the grounds. Snape told him not to call him a coward. Then he was gone. Voldemort appointed Severus Snape as headmaster of Hogwarts in August of 1997, and the appointment was exactly what it appeared to be, and exactly the opposite of what it appeared to be simultaneously. As a reward, it was genuine. Snape had killed Dumbledore in front of witnesses, and delivered what Voldemort had been trying to accomplish for 16 years. The position of headmaster at the most important magical school in Britain was a recognition of service. It was also a placement. Voldemort wanted someone in the school who was his, who answered to him, who could turn Hogwarts from a sanctuary into something that served the larger project of reshaping the wizarding world. Snape accepted the appointment. He also accepted the two Death Eaters Voldemort assigned as his deputies, Alecto Carrow, who would take over Muggle studies, and Amicus Carrow, who would teach defense against the dark arts. The Carrows were not educators in any meaningful sense of the word. Alecto used her class to teach a curriculum devoted to the argument that Muggles were subhuman and that their presence in the magical world constituted a contamination. Amicus used his class to have students practice the Cruciatus Curse on other students. They used physical punishment for minor infractions and worse than physical punishment for anything they chose to classify as more than minor. Snape, as headmaster, had authority over all of this. From the outside, and from Voldemort's perspective, which was the perspective that mattered for the performance, Snape appeared to be running Hogwarts as Voldemort expected it to be run. Order was maintained. Rules were enforced. The Carrows had the freedom they needed to implement the new curriculum. Students who formed a resistance organization inside the school, as students did under the unofficial leadership of the Longbottom Boy and the Weasley Girl and Luna Lovegood, were addressed through the mechanisms of institutional authority. What was happening inside those mechanisms? When students were referred to the Carrows for punishment, Snape frequently intervened at the administrative level. He created procedural requirements. He rerouted referrals. He found reasons to send students who had been marked for punishment to Hagrid instead, to serve detention doing outdoor work with a man who cared about them and would not hurt them. The reasons given for this redirection were always administrative, always plausible, always documented in the institutional record as standard procedure. When the Carrows proposed escalations that would have caused lasting harm to students, Snape generated paperwork. There were forms required. There were processes that had to be followed. There were consultations with the ministry that the ministry did not know were fictional. He created administrative friction at every point where friction could reduce the damage reaching the students, and he did it in ways that left no fingerprints. He could not eliminate the year, he could only reduce it. This distinction matters enormously and is also insufficient comfort for the students who were hurt during that year. Children were tortured at Hogwarts in 1997 and 1998. The Carrows were cruel, and Snape was headmaster when they were doing it. The fact that they could have been crueler, that the headmaster's administrative interference reduced the frequency and severity of the worst of it, does not change what actually happened. Both things are true. He had regular conversations with Dumbledore's portrait, which hung in the headmaster's office, along with the portraits of all the previous headmasters going back centuries. Dumbledore's portrait retained everything that Dumbledore had known when he was alive. The portrait could advise, could remember, could carry on the plan Dumbledore had set in motion. These conversations were, for Snape, one of the stranger features of the year. Dumbledore dead was more present than many living people. The portrait moved and spoke and remembered and occasionally disagreed with Snape's decisions in ways that were frankly irritating given the circumstances. The other headmaster portraits watched these exchanges with varying degrees of interest, particularly Phineas Nigellus Black, who had opinions about almost everything. The Sword of Gryffindor was also in the headmaster's office, having been placed there after the events of the previous year. Dumbledore's portrait told Snape that Harry was going to need the sword, and that the question was how to get it to him, without triggering Voldemort's attention. If Snape simply sent the sword to Harry, the action would be traceable. There had to be a mechanism. The mechanism Snape designed was elegant in the way that the best solutions are elegant. It left no trace of his involvement, and required Harry to do something genuinely difficult to reach it. He would use his Patronus to lead Harry to the sword. He would leave the sword somewhere Harry could find it only through effort that would test him. A frozen pool in a dark forest, he decided, the sword resting on the bottom, visible through the ice. Harry would have to break the ice and dive for it in the cold. The Horcrux around Harry's neck would make the attempt harder, because it responded to Harry's proximity to objects of good that it feared. Someone would need to be watching from a distance to ensure Harry survived the attempt. He arranged this in December of 1997, in the weeks before the Christmas break, while monitoring Harry's location through the information that passed through the intelligence networks Snape had access to, as a senior member of Voldemort's inner circle. The portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black, which could travel between its frame in the headmaster's office and a second frame in a family property, provided Snape with information about where Harry was camping, the Forest of Dean. Snape went to the forest. He stood among the trees at a distance sufficient to ensure he was not seen. He pointed his wand at the sky above the trees and spoke the incantation for the Patronus charm. From his wand, the silver doe emerged, Lily's shape, moving through the dark trees with the soft, self-contained light of a Patronus in the night, casting enough illumination to follow but not enough to see who had sent it. He watched it go. In December of 1997, Harry Potter was cold and frightened and stuck. He and Hermione were camping in the Forest of Dean under the Fidelius protection of their magical tent, hiding from a wizarding world that was actively searching for them, and the search for Horcruxes had stalled in ways that were making everything harder. Ron had left weeks earlier, driven out by the emotional amplification of the Slytherin locket Horcrux that Harry had been wearing for months. Harry could feel the Horcrux working on him even now, a weight that pressed on his thoughts and made him irritable and suspicious and prone to a dark quality of thinking that arrived without invitation. Hermione was nearby in the tent, monitoring the magical protection that kept them hidden and trying not to show how frightened she was. Harry went outside into the cold to think. The forest was dark in the way that forests are dark at night in December, which is different from the darkness of buildings or streets. It was a living dark, with sounds in it that could not quite be identified, and movement in the undergrowth that was almost certainly animals, and felt like something else. Harry stood in the cold air, and breathed, and tried to think, and found it difficult. Then a silver doe stepped out from between the trees. It was a Patronus, unmistakably. It had the particular quality of a Patronus, the silver-white light that came from inside it, rather than reflecting off a surface, the stillness it carried even while moving, the sense that it was made of something different from the matter that made up ordinary things. It stood at the edge of Harry's sight for a moment, then moved. Harry followed. The doe led him through the trees for several minutes without hurrying, never going so far ahead that he lost sight of it. It moved with the patience of something that knew where it was going and was willing to wait for the person following to keep up. It crossed a clearing, passed between two particularly large oaks that had grown so close together, their branches intertwined, and stopped at the edge of a pool. The pool was frozen. It was roughly circular, perhaps 10 feet across, the ice thick and clear, except near the edges where the cold had worked into the bank. Through the ice, visible in the Patronus's silver light, something was resting on the bottom. The sword of Gryffindor. Harry stared at it for a moment, and the doe dissolved, and the forest went dark around the pool again. He broke the ice with a branch, and the sound of it was loud in the quiet. He took off his coat. He waded in. The cold was extreme in the way that water in December is cold, not uncomfortable but potentially dangerous, the kind of cold that takes motor control if you let it. The locket horcrux on his chest responded to his proximity to the sword by tightening around his neck, a strangling sensation that was magical in origin and real in effect. He went under. He reached the sword and could not hold it. The locket tightened further. The cold was working on his hands. He pulled up and kicked for the surface and was not reaching it. Someone else was there. Ron Weasley, who had found his way back to them through the magic of a deluminator Dumbledore had left him, jumped into the pool and pulled Harry out and retrieved the sword from the bottom. He came out blue and shivering with the sword in his hands, and Harry gasping on the bank. They used the sword to destroy the locket. Harry asked afterward whether Ron had seen who had sent the doe. Ron had seen nothing except the pool. Snape had been watching from a distance sufficient to ensure he was not seen. He had watched Harry go in. He had watched the locket react, had seen the struggle through the ice, and had already determined what he would have to do if Ron had not arrived when he did. He did not have to intervene. Ron arrived, and Harry survived, and the sword reached Harry's hands through exactly the mechanism it was meant to reach them. He turned and walked back through the dark trees to wherever he had come to the forest from, having done what he came to do, having not been seen, having left Harry with what he needed, and no way to know where it came from. The doe was Lily's shape. He had made it from the one thing that had stayed the same in him through all of it, and for a few minutes on a winter night in the Forest of Dean, it had walked through the dark ahead of Harry Potter and shown him the way to something he needed, and then it had dissolved back into the magic it was made of, and left no trace except the things it had made possible. Voldemort had determined, with the specific quality of logic he applied to everything, that Snape had to die. The reasoning was about the Elder Wand. The Elder Wand was the most powerful wand in existence, one of the 3 legendary Deathly Hallows, and Voldemort had taken it from Dumbledore's tomb in June of 1997. The wand in his hands was performing at the ordinary level of an excellent wand, not at the extraordinary level its legend suggested it was capable of. Voldemort had spent months thinking about why. The answer he arrived at was the theory of wand allegiance. Wands chose their master through specific acts of conquest or defeat, and they transferred their allegiance not to whoever held them physically, but to whoever had most recently overcome the previous master. The Elder Wand had belonged to Dumbledore. Dumbledore had been killed by Snape. Snape had therefore conquered Dumbledore in the wand's terms, which meant the wand's allegiance had passed to Snape. The Elder Wand believed its true master was Snape. Voldemort could not simply take the wand from Snape and expect it to work correctly for him, because the wand's loyalty did not follow physical possession. He needed to defeat the wand's master. He needed the wand's current master to be someone he had already defeated in the relevant sense. He could not duel Snape without risking the possibility that Snape would win, which was out of the question given what Snape's apparent victory would mean. He did what he did instead. In the Shrieking Shack, at Hogwarts, on the night of May 1st, 1998, Voldemort spoke clearly and almost kindly to Snape about the necessity of what he was about to do. He was sorry, he said, in the tone of someone who was not sorry at all, but understood that performing sorrow was the appropriate behavior for the occasion. He had valued Snape's service. He hoped Snape understood that this was regrettable but necessary. Snape stood before him with the controlled expression he had worn for 30 years of double life, and whatever he was feeling in that moment was entirely contained within it. Voldemort gave the command to Nagini. The snake attacked from the protective shield Voldemort had conjured around her, and the fangs went in at the throat and the side of the neck, and Voldemort watched to ensure the damage was sufficient, and then walked out of the shack with his retinue, and Nagini reforming around his presence. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been hidden under Harry's invisibility cloak in the same room throughout this exchange. They had come because Harry had been guided to the shack by what appeared to be the logical location for Voldemort's command position during the battle at Hogwarts. They had heard the conversation and watched the attack from inside the cloak, unable to intervene, unable to be seen. When the Death Eaters were gone, they came out. Snape was dying on the floor of the Shrieking Shack, with snake venom from one of the most dangerous magical creatures alive moving through his system. Basilisk venom, phoenix tears, various potions could counter many venoms. The specific neurotoxin that Nagini carried was something different, designed by dark magic to work faster than most antidotes could function. He had minutes. He looked up at Harry when Harry came close enough to see him. He reached toward Harry with a hand that was already losing its steadiness, and what came from his eyes, from his ears, from his skin, was not blood, it was memory. Silver and dense and pressing against the air, with the urgency of something that had been waiting years to be released. The memories flooded out of him in a stream that Harry collected in an empty flask he had conjured, and Snape watched him do it and did not look away. He was losing blood. He was losing consciousness. He was losing the specific quality of controlled presence that he had maintained through every room and every conversation and every performance for 17 years. He looked at Harry's face. He said, "Look at me." Harry looked at him. What Harry saw in the dying man's expression was something that did not fit the category of enemy or traitor or the man who had killed Dumbledore. What he saw was grief and relief, and the look of someone seeing what they came back to the world to see, and then seeing it for the last time. Green eyes, Lily's eyes, in the face of her son, in the face of the boy he had spent 17 years protecting through the only mechanisms available to him, cruelty and lies and silence, and the sustained performance of a person he was not. Snape died on the floor of the Shrieking Shack with Harry's face in front of him and Lily's eyes looking back at him from it, and if there was anything resembling peace in the end of his particular life, it was probably that. What Harry understood about him at that moment was nothing. He had the memories in the flask. He did not yet know what they contained. Harry poured the memories into the stone basin of Dumbledore's Pensieve in the headmaster's office. He dropped into them. He found himself in a place he had never been, a small back garden in a Midlands town, with a girl with red hair and a boy with dark hair, watching her from the side of the property, with the specific quality of someone who has been watching from this position before and has learned how to do it without being obvious about it. He recognized the girl. He had seen photographs. He had seen her face in a mirror, in Godric's Hollow, and in a body lying on the floor of a cottage he had only visited once, in the dark, in a vision he could not control. The girl was his mother. The boy was Snape. He watched what followed over the years of both of their childhoods, in the compressed way that memories work in the Pensieve, moving between significant moments with the directness of memory, rather than the linear continuity of lived experience. He watched Snape tell Lily Evans she was a witch, watched her response, watched the beginning of a friendship with the particular quality of friendships between children who have found someone who makes the world make sense. He watched them move through Hogwarts together. He watched Snape disappear into the dark circle, and Lily stay beside him longer than she probably should have, pulling him back from its edges by being someone he cared about enough to try to pull back for. He watched her fail at that eventually. He watched the incident by the lake in 5th year, from the wrong angle, from Snape's angle, which was an angle Harry had never considered, and it was harder to watch from there than it had ever been from the angle of the audience. He watched Lily walk away. He watched Snape go to Dumbledore. He watched the conversation in Dumbledore's office with a quality of attention that altered the entire frame of everything he thought he knew. He had always assumed, when he thought about Snape's origins at Hogwarts, that Dumbledore had recruited him from Voldemort's organization for strategic reasons, in the way that intelligence organizations recruited double agents, functionally, transactionally, with the primary concern being utility. What he saw instead was a man in anguish in an office, asking someone to protect the woman he loved, and a headmaster who was willing to use that anguish as a resource, but was not unmoved by it. He saw the Patronus. He saw Dumbledore ask Snape, after all this time, and Snape say always, and the silver doe moving through the headmaster's office, and Dumbledore's face as he watched it. He saw the conversation about Harry being a Horcrux. He saw Snape's face when Dumbledore told him what that meant for the plan. He saw Snape's response, the words about raising a pig for slaughter, which was both an accusation and an accurate description, and Dumbledore's failure to deny it, which was both a concession and a form of respect for Snape's intelligence. He saw the moment Dumbledore told Snape that he would have to be the one to tell Harry, at the right moment, what Harry needed to do. That Snape was the person Dumbledore trusted to manage this specific and terrible communication, because only someone who loved Harry would carry it with the right amount of care. He saw what Snape's face did when Dumbledore said that, and it was a thing he would spend years afterward trying to properly understand. He came out of the Pensieve. He sat in the headmaster's chair for a long moment in the middle of the battle that was still happening below and outside the walls of the school, with the weight of everything he had just seen sitting on him, in the specific way that revelations sit, heavy and rearranging, the feeling of a framework being replaced in real time. Every contemptuous look, every subtracted point, every calculated cruelty in the potions classroom, every time Snape had made Harry feel worthless and watched and resented and insignificant, every confrontation and denial and performance of hostility that had run for 7 years through Harry's time at Hogwarts. All of it was the price of staying inside the position. All of it was what the work required of a man who had decided, in grief and guilt and desperate love, to make Lily's death mean something by keeping her son alive. The man who had seemed the most obvious villain of Harry's school years had been the most continuous and the most invisible protection he had. Harry got up. He walked to the window. He looked out at the battle. He understood, now, what he had to do and why he had to do it, and the fact that he understood it was because a dying man on the floor of the Shrieking Shack had pressed 17 years of memories into his hands with the last of his strength and said, "Look at me." Harry walked into the Forbidden Forest. He went to meet Voldemort with the knowledge that he had to die. He went there having understood, in the last 10 minutes, that the man he had most reliably hated throughout his time at Hogwarts had loved his mother more than anything else in his life, and had organized everything in his adult existence around the single consequence of her death that he could still influence. He thought about this as he walked into the dark under the trees. After the battle, after the counted dead, and the initial reckoning, and the exhausted few days in which the wizarding world began the slow process of understanding that it was over, someone had to establish what Severus Snape had actually been. It was not a simple accounting. The Harry Potter side of the story was straightforward enough. Snape had been a double agent working for Dumbledore throughout both wizarding wars, and his apparent defection to Voldemort's side in the Second War had been arranged with Dumbledore's full knowledge and served the purposes of the intelligence operation that contributed, in the end, to Voldemort's defeat. Harry testified to this at the ministry hearings that followed. He described the memories. He described what they contained. He described the doe Patronus in the Forest of Dean and the sword at the bottom of the frozen pool. He described the conversation between Snape and Dumbledore, in which Snape agreed to kill Dumbledore at Dumbledore's request, and the conversation in which Dumbledore told Snape about Harry being a Horcrux, and the instructions Snape had carried for months about what to tell Harry when the time came. The Wizengamot listened to all of this. There were complications. The students who had attended Hogwarts in the year of Snape's headmastership were called to give testimony as well, because the hearings were trying to establish a complete account, and a complete account required what had happened in that school under that administration. They testified about the Carrows. They testified about the punishments. They testified about students who had been hurt in ways that were real and lasting and had happened while Snape was the head of the institution, responsible for their safety. The fact that Snape had been running interference, reducing the damage, rerouting referrals, inventing administrative obstacles at every point he could find one, this was harder to document than the damage itself. The damage was visible. The prevention was, by its nature, invisible. The students who ended up with Hagrid in the pumpkin patch instead of in the Carrows classroom did not necessarily know they had been rerouted rather than simply lucky. It took time, and it took the testimony of multiple people, including Hagrid himself, who had kept records of the detentions he had supervised in the year of Snape's headmastership, and could demonstrate the pattern clearly. It took Minerva McGonagall's testimony about the administrative logs she had found in the headmaster's office, which showed a consistent pattern of Carrow-assigned punishments being diverted through procedures that required Snape's authorization before being carried out, and which were frequently never carried out because the procedures remained incomplete. The portrait of Albus Dumbledore in the headmaster's office spoke at the hearings, which created its own procedural complications, since Wizengamot rules regarding the testimony of painted portraits in oil were somewhat underdeveloped. They admitted the testimony. Snape was posthumously cleared of all charges. The headmaster's portrait was installed in the office gallery. His name was added to the records of the school's headmasters in the category of those who had served with distinction, which was a category that required some definitional flexibility, given the full account of what his service had contained. Harry named his second son Albus Severus. He told the boy that 2 headmasters of Hogwarts had borne those names, and that one of them had been a Slytherin, and that he personally considered him the bravest man he had ever known. This was not an overstatement. It was the particular kind of bravery that does not require an audience, and in fact cannot have one. The bravery of a person who continues in the right direction without being able to tell anyone what the direction is or why they chose it. It is the bravery of a performance sustained under conditions of permanent danger for 17 years, not out of duty to an abstract principle, but out of love for one specific person and the one specific consequence of her death that he still had the power to influence. He had loved Lily Evans. He had carried that love from the river in Cokeworth through Hogwarts, and through the First War, and through the night in Godric's Hollow, and through 10 years of waiting, and through 7 years of Harry's time at Hogwarts, and through the year of the Death Eater headmastership, and through the Shrieking Shack, and into the end. He carried it in the shape of a silver doe that walked through dark forests and frozen winter fields, and the corridors of a school where he was spending his life, doing something no one could see. The love did not make him good in any comprehensive sense. He was not a good man, in the way that some of the other people in this story were good people. He had been cruel when cruelty was not required by the work. He had been petty when pettiness served nothing except old wounds. He had taken pleasure, or something resembling pleasure, in certain opportunities to exercise power over people who had once made him feel powerless, and this is not redeemed by the larger architecture of what he was trying to do. But inside all of that, alongside all of that, he had run an operation for 17 years that held Harry Potter alive against an extraordinary number of things that should have killed him. He had done this without acknowledgement, without the possibility of acknowledgement, with the permanent necessity of appearing to be the opposite of what he was. He had told every lie it took. And that, dear listener, is the accounting of Severus Snape. There is no version of this story in which he is simply a hero, and there is no version in which he is simply a villain. He is something more honest than either, which is a person who contained both simultaneously, sometimes operating from the best of himself, and sometimes from the worst of it, and who found a way to do something extraordinary inside the complicated mixture that he was. The stories we tell ourselves about people tend toward clarity. We want the villain to be wholly bad, the hero to be wholly good, the sacrifices to be made by people who were already pure and therefore deserving of commemoration. What the story of Severus Snape offers instead is the more difficult truth that the most important thing anyone did in a particular corner of a particular conflict was done by a man who was also capable of cruelty toward children, of pettiness, of holding grudges with a tenacity that went well past the original grievance and into something that served only his own wound, and that the love motivating it all was love for a specific person who had been dead for 17 years, love that could not be expressed or acknowledged or even fully understood from the outside, love that operated entirely in the dark, in the shape of a silver doe and a maintained cover, and a classroom full of resentments that protected something the classroom did not know it was protecting. We come to the end of a long night's telling now. The candles have burned low, the house is quiet around you. If you have been lying in the dark since the beginning of this story, following Severus Snape from the leaning house on Spinner's End, to the river, and then to Hogwarts, and then through all the years, and all the lies, and all the performances it took to keep one boy alive, We hope the story reached something in you that the light of ordinary hours does not always have time to reach. The best we can do with the people we love, sometimes, is to keep going in the direction they would have wanted, in the dark, without anyone knowing we are doing it. Let us return, for a moment, to the specific texture of what Snape found in Voldemort's movement that he could not find anywhere else. The standard account of Death Eater recruitment in the 1970s treats it as primarily ideological, young witches and wizards from pure-blood families absorbing the prejudices of those families and finding a movement that validated them. This is accurate for most of the recruits Snape would have known. Avery and Mulciber and the others who made up the Dark Circle in the Slytherin common room came from precisely those backgrounds, with precisely those inherited convictions, and the step from the common room to the Death Eaters was for them less a conversion than a formalization. Snape's path was different. He was not from a pure-blood family. He was half Muggle by blood, which should have made him an unacceptable recruit by the movement's own stated criteria. What he was instead was extraordinarily talented, and visibly angry, and possessed of a set of dark arts skills that Voldemort found genuinely useful. Voldemort's inner circle, whatever its public ideological commitments, was in practice a meritocracy of a very specific kind. It rewarded capacity for dark magic and loyalty expressed through action. Snape's blood status was an inconvenience Voldemort chose to overlook, because what Snape could do was worth more than what he was made of. This told Snape something that nothing in his life before that point had told him, that the things that had always been held against him could be overridden by what he was capable of. The poverty of Spinner's End, the half-blood status that made him technically unacceptable by the standards of the very community that was recruiting him, the long years of being the wrong kind of person in every room he occupied, none of these disqualified him from recognition in this context. There is a specific kind of psychological wound that produces a specific kind of vulnerability, and it is the wound of a person who has spent their formative years being told they are not sufficient. Such people are particularly susceptible to any environment that says, "Yes, you are sufficient. You are in fact valuable. What you can do is exactly what we need." The recognition does not have to be moral. It does not have to come from people who are good. The relief of finally being acknowledged is powerful enough to override the source. Snape received this recognition from Voldemort's organization at the precise moment when Lily had walked away, when the Hogwarts years were ending, with the specific balance of intelligence recognized and humanity dismantled that his experience of school had produced, when the alternatives were the unclear future of a young man with no family support and no obvious place in the wizarding world that would take him seriously. He made the choice that was available. The Death Eater years were real, and he was not an innocent participant in them. He participated in actions he later declined to specify. He was not a clerk. He was not a passive presence at the edges of the organization. He was useful and he was used, and the things he was used for were the things that Death Eaters in active service during the First War did. The wizarding world of the late 1970s was a place where Muggle families disappeared, and Muggle-born witches and wizards were found dead, in circumstances the Ministry was slow to investigate, and Snape was inside the organization responsible for those things. He also continued developing his skills. The Death Eater years were, among other things, years of extraordinary magical development. He had access to knowledge and to practitioners of a quality that no Hogwarts curriculum provided. His potions expertise reached levels that very few wizards alive could match. His knowledge of curse construction and counter-curse theory became, in those years, perhaps the most sophisticated in the wizarding world outside of Voldemort himself. He was learning everything available to him, because learning had always been the primary mechanism through which he made sense of himself, and the environment he was learning in happened to be a criminal organization. None of this can be neatly disentangled from the other, and the attempt to do so produces something false. The same years that produced the extraordinary skill were the years of the things he did not speak about. They were the same years. Then came the Hog's Head. Then came the realization of what his surveillance report had started. Then came Lily's name connected to a prophecy target, and everything in him that had been navigating the Death Eater years, with some version of a functional conscience caught up with what he had done and what was going to happen because of it, and he ran. After the night in Godric's Hollow, it is worth sitting with what Snape was actually carrying. Guilt of this specific kind, guilt for a death you caused through a chain of choices that each felt defensible at the time, is different from other forms of guilt. It does not respond to argument. You can present it with all the mitigating circumstances available, and it will acknowledge them and continue. You can note that you did not know, when you carried the prophecy fragment, that the prophecy would identify Lily's son, and it will agree that you did not know, and continue. You can note that Voldemort made his own choice about which child to target, and you cannot be held responsible for that choice, and it will acknowledge the logical validity of the point, and continue. This is because guilt of this specific kind is not primarily a logical position. It is the statement that a particular person is dead, and you were part of the reason, and now you must live with that in every room you enter for the rest of your life. Snape was 21 years old when Lily died. He was 21, and he had been carrying a set of emotional tools that were not well suited to the scale of what had just happened. His history had given him the capacity for vigilance, for performance, for the management of external appearance. It had given him intelligence and dark arts ability, and an extraordinary talent for understanding how things worked beneath their surfaces. It had not given him an adequate mechanism for grief. He had not had enough normal relationships to have practiced loss at a human scale before this one. The first significant loss of his life was Lily's friendship, and he had processed that loss primarily through the mechanism of diversion into the Death Eater community. The second significant loss was Lily herself, and there was no comparable diversion available. So he built his functioning around it instead of through it. He structured his daily life so that the grief had a purpose. Every morning he woke up and there was something specific to be done. Classes to teach, intelligence to gather, performances to maintain, a boy to protect from things that boy did not know were coming. The purpose did not diminish the grief. It just meant the grief was attached to something rather than free-floating, and attached grief is at least directional. He taught potions in the dungeons for a decade, with Lily's death in him every day. He watched Hogwarts students learn to brew things they mostly found difficult, and occasionally found impossible, and somewhere in the back of his awareness was always the fact of a woman in a house in Godric's Hollow, and the specific shape the loss had taken, and what had caused it. When Harry Potter arrived, the grief attached itself to something new without diminishing. It attached itself to watching Lily's eyes in a room and not being able to acknowledge what seeing them meant. That is a particular kind of sustained pain that does not have a clean name. He sustained it for 7 more years after Harry arrived, on top of the 10 years before. In the year of Snape's headmastership, there were specific incidents that illustrate the shape of what he was doing under the visible surface of the administration he was running. In November 1997, 3 students were reported to Amicus Carrow for organizing a meeting in the Room of Requirement, which had been designated as prohibited space by the new regime. The Carrow report specified the Cruciatus Curse as the appropriate disciplinary measure. Snape's administrative response was to reclassify the infraction as a procedural violation rather than a substantive one, which moved it into a different disciplinary category under the school's governance structure. The new category required the infraction to be reviewed by the headmaster before any physical punishment was applied. The review was scheduled. Various conditions had to be met before the review could proceed. The conditions were not met within the required window. The case was administratively closed. In February 1998, a Muggle-born student who had returned to Hogwarts in violation of the year's new registration requirements was identified and detained. The Carrow protocol for this category of student was to hold them in a specific location and summon ministry officials, who were then expected to process them through a system Snape understood the endpoint of. He reclassified the student as a special administrative matter and removed them from Carrow jurisdiction. The special administrative matter was handled by Snape personally. The student disappeared from the school's formal record. They survived the war. In March 1998, Amicus Carrow submitted a request to implement a new detention regime for the resistance cell operating inside the school, a regime that would have involved systematic use of dark magic on students who were already frightened and already being hurt by the existing protocols. Snape returned the request for additional documentation on 11 separate grounds. The documentation was never completed to the standard required. The regime was never implemented. None of these interventions appear in the post-war account of the year as acts of resistance. They appear in the administrative records as procedural matters. The students involved often did not know they had been protected. The protection left no fingerprints. It is also true, and cannot be set aside, that students were hurt during this year, regardless of Snape's interventions. The interventions reduced what was happening. They did not stop it. The difference between the headmaster who was doing what Snape was doing and a headmaster who was simply doing Voldemort's administration was real. It was also insufficient. Both of these things are true. Dumbledore's portrait watched the administrative record accumulate with the particular expressiveness that oil paint on canvas can achieve when the intelligence behind it was once extraordinary. He did not offer Snape congratulation. He offered instruction. There was still work to do. Harry was in the Pensieve for a very long time, in the relative way that time works when you are in someone else's memories. He watched Snape's childhood in the way that childhood memories present themselves, not as organized narrative but as sensory impressions collected around specific moments of significance. The house on Spinner's End was a fact he now inhabited for a few minutes, understanding it from the inside rather than as an abstraction. The river was real, the grass on the bank was real, the girl with red hair was real, in a way that she had not been real to him for a very long time. He watched their friendship the way you watch something you know the ending of and wish you could change. Lily Evans was a particular person in those memories. She was not the saint she had been made into in the Wizarding World's account of her death and what it meant. She was a girl who was sometimes impatient, who occasionally got things wrong, who had a competitive quality alongside the generosity, and who could be hurt in ordinary ways by ordinary things. She was real. He watched the friendship fail. He had known about the incident by the lake in 5th year. He had seen it once before, in Snape's memories during the disastrous occlumency lesson of 5th year, when he and Snape had found themselves in each other's awareness more directly than either of them intended. But he had seen it then from a distance, and without the complete context that surrounded it in these memories. He saw it now from inside, which was different. He watched Snape wait outside the Gryffindor Tower that night, and watched Lily refuse to come back down, and what he felt watching this was something that he did not have a clean word for. It was not sympathy exactly, and it was not absolution, because the word had been said, and could not be unsaid. It was something more like the recognition of a person in a moment of maximum damage to themselves, the recognition that the thing he had done was the thing he would spend the rest of his life unable to undo. He watched the later years in a kind of compressed grief that the Pensieve managed with the efficiency of memory. Not every day of the Death Eater years, not every moment of the conversion, not every step of the journey between the person who loved Lily and the person who stood before Dumbledore in anguish, asking for her protection. Just the essential points, the structure. He watched always. He had known the word existed, had heard it used without fully understanding why it mattered. He watched Dumbledore ask the question, and Snape say the word, and the silver doe step through the office, and he understood it now, not as a romantic statement, not as something that fit neatly into the categories he had previously used for Snape, as a statement of fact about the internal organization of a person, that the love had remained the primary fact of his inner life through everything else that had happened, and that the Patronus charm, which did not respond to performance, confirmed this with the blunt accuracy of a mechanism that only found what was genuinely there. He watched the conversation about the Horcrux. He had not known until that moment, in the Pensieve, that Snape had known, that Snape had been carrying the knowledge of what Harry was, and what that meant for the plan, while teaching him potions, and monitoring him in the corridors of Hogwarts, and protecting him through every year of his time at the school. Snape had known Harry was going to have to die, had known this for over a year before Harry did, and had continued doing everything the plan required, including the things that were specifically designed to ensure that Harry was capable of the sacrifice the plan required. What he felt about this, standing in the Pensieve with the memory of Snape's face in that conversation, could not be resolved into a simple emotion. He climbed out of the basin and sat in the headmaster's chair. He thought about contempt and cruelty and the specific texture of 7 years of being made to feel small in a potions classroom. He thought about the counter-curse at the Quidditch match and what would have happened without it. He thought about a silver doe walking through dark trees. He thought about a dying man on the floor of the Shrieking Shack saying, "Look at me." He was 17 years old, and he had just learned that the person he had most reliably hated had loved his mother more than anything in a long and difficult life, and had organized everything around what that love required of him. He walked out of the headmaster's office. He walked down through the damaged castle. He walked into the forbidden forest. He met Voldemort. He died, as the plan required, in the way the plan required, and came back in the way that Dumbledore had believed was possible. And later, when it was over, he thought about the fact that what had made it possible to go into the forest was understanding what it was for, and what had given him that understanding was 17 years of memories pressed into his hands by a dying man who had spent 17 years being the villain in order to make this ending possible. The period after Voldemort's death was strange for everyone who had survived it, but it was strange in particular ways for the people whose relationship to the events was not simple. Harry Potter's account of Snape's double life was taken seriously because Harry was Harry, and because Hermione had the documentation, and because the memories were the memories and spoke clearly. But the process of incorporating that account into the wizarding world's understanding of what had happened was not quick and was not without resistance. The difficulty was this: two things could be simultaneously true in ways that did not resolve each other. Snape had protected Harry Potter and had worked against Voldemort from inside his organization throughout both wars. Snape had also been the head of a school where children were tortured during the year of the Death Eater administration. The first thing did not erase the second thing did not erase the first. Both existed in the same person, in the same record, and required accommodation rather than resolution. Some people found this accommodation impossible. Parents of students who had been hurt during that year at Hogwarts were not immediately interested in the nuance. The boy who had been cruciated by Amicus Carrow while Snape was headmaster was not required to feel that Snape's larger contributions to the resistance absolved the institution that had allowed it. He was correct not to feel this. The harm done to him was real, and was not reduced by the fact that the headmaster who presided over it had been simultaneously running interference on the Carrow administration. Other people came to the view that Snape's record, taken whole, was one of the more complex in the history of either war, and that complex did not mean good or bad, but meant both, which was true of a larger number of people than the stories we tell about wars usually acknowledge. Time processed this complexity with its usual bluntness. The portrait went up, the hearings concluded, the name was cleared. Life in the wizarding world moved through the necessary stages of repair and rebuilding, and the gradual return of things that had been suspended or destroyed during the years of Voldemort's 2 attempts at power. Harry named his son Albus Severus in 2006. He told the boy on the platform, when the boy was anxious about which house he would be sorted into, that the bravest man he had ever known had been a Slytherin, and that the house was not the measure. The boy got on the train. What Snape's name on a boy at a train station communicated about what Harry had come to understand, and what he chose to carry forward from it, is not something the record specifies in detail. Names are a particular kind of meaning-making, a way of saying that this person existed and mattered and should not be forgotten, a way of carrying someone into the future without being able to carry them in any other form. Severus Snape, the boy from Spinner's End who learned to watch from a distance, and found one friend who saw him clearly, and lost her, and spent the rest of his life trying to repair what her loss had cost, would persist in the name of a child on a train, going to Hogwarts for the first time. The silver doe, in whatever form it takes when there is no longer a person to cast it, would persist in the way that things persist when they have passed through someone's hands and into the world completely. The love that shaped it would remain what it had always been, permanent, unchanged, passed to the thing most worth protecting, always. What Snape learned in the Slytherin common room between the ages of 12 and 18 was not what the curriculum taught, and not what the teachers intended. He learned the dark arts at a level of technical sophistication that went well past what the defense classes offered. The circle around Avery and Mulciber had access to texts that were not in the school library, texts that circulated among certain families in certain communities, and moved hand to hand through a network that the wizarding academic establishment officially did not acknowledge. Snape read all of them. He read them with the same focused, annotating, questioning attention he brought to everything he read, and he brought to them the specific mind he had developed in his mother's kitchen on Spinner's End, a mind that found the structure of things and then looked for ways to modify the structure. He invented spells. Several of them. By his fourth year, he had developed a lever corpus variant that worked differently from the standard form, a set of hexes that he tested in privacy and refined over multiple attempts, and the beginnings of what would eventually become Sectum Sempra in a form that was still theoretical. He wrote all of these into the margins and blank pages of his textbooks, noting the incantations, the wand movements, the theoretical principles, the specific expected effects. He was 17 years old and producing original magic of a quality that most wizards never reach. The dark arts education was also a social education in a different sense. He learned what kind of people used magic this way and what they believed about themselves. He learned the specific texture of pure blood ideology from the inside, which is a different education than learning it from the outside. From the inside, you understand that it is not experienced primarily as ideology at all by the people who hold it. It is experienced as fact, as the obvious truth about how the world is organized, as the thing that everyone with eyes and sense can see. The people in that common room were not performing a position. They had absorbed it so completely that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. Snape was not a pureblood. This should have made him an outsider in this community. It did, slightly, but the outsider status was overridden by the utility of what he knew and what he could do. He was the person you came to when your hex wasn't working the way you wanted it to work. He was the person who had already read the book you had just found. He was the person whose opinion on a question of curse theory was worth getting. Being useful in this way was not the same as being valued as a person. He understood this. He was not entirely deceived by the community's acceptance of him, but it was closer to acceptance than anything else available, and he needed something closer to acceptance than anything else available, and so he stayed. Lily kept reaching across the divide. She kept appearing in his peripheral vision in the corridor and asking whether he was all right, kept writing to him in the careful, specific way she wrote to people she actually cared about, kept telling him that she could see where he was going and that it frightened her. She was not wrong to be frightened. He was going somewhere she could not follow, and he was choosing it. And some part of him understood this, and another part of him had convinced itself that understanding it was the same as being able to stop. It was not the same thing. The incident by the lake in 5th year was not a surprise in retrospect. The conditions for it had been building since 2nd year. The surprise was only that it happened when it did, and in that particular way, and that the specific word was directed at the specific person, and that there was no recovery afterward. He had been heading toward that word for 3 years, and he had known it, and had not been able to stop. The First Wizarding War, which ran from approximately 1970 to 1981, was not a war in the sense of armies meeting on designated fields. It was a sustained campaign of targeted violence against specific categories of people, running parallel to ordinary life in the wizarding world, with enough visibility to cause widespread fear, and not enough visibility to force a definitive confrontation. Muggle families near the locations of Death Eater activity found their relatives dead of no explicable cause. Muggle-born witches and wizards disappeared from the wizarding community at a rate the Ministry classified as suspicious and did not adequately address. The Auror Corps was stretched past its effective capacity and losing members faster than it could replace them. People stopped using the telephone because telephones could be tapped, and stopped using Owlpost for anything they did not want read, and started using the Fidelius charm for houses that had previously had no need of it. The mood of the wizarding world in those years was the specific mood of a community under a sustained low-grade siege, frightened enough to change behavior, not frightened enough to organize effectively, uncertain about who around them might be a Death Eater or a sympathizer, or simply a person who had concluded that silence was the safest posture. Snape moved through this world as a Death Eater in active service. His specific role was not frontline violence of the most visible kind. He was too valuable in a support capacity for Voldemort to risk him in operations that were effectively expendable. His expertise in potions made him an essential contributor to the production of substances the Death Eater community needed: healing potions for injured members, poisons for targeted use, the complex preparations required for certain dark rituals. His knowledge of curse theory made him useful as an advisor on specific operations. This meant he was present in the organizational infrastructure of a criminal enterprise that was committing sustained violence against people based on their blood status. He was not committing the violence directly, in most cases. He was enabling it, which is a different category of participation, and not a morally different one in any meaningful sense. He knew this. He knew it in the background of the years he spent in that role, in the way that people know things they have accepted but have not fully reckoned with. The reckoning came when Lily's name appeared in the accounting of what his work had contributed to. After the war's end, after Voldemort's fall, and the Death Eater trials, and Snape's testimony, and Dumbledore's vouching, there was a period during which Snape's status in the wizarding world was the ambiguous status of someone who had been cleared, but was known to have been present. He was not celebrated, he was not condemned, he was largely avoided by people who had strong feelings about the First War, and tolerated by people who had the capacity for ambiguity. He taught potions, he prepared for what was coming. The Death Eaters who had been imprisoned in Azkaban began escaping as Voldemort's power began to return in the early 1990s. The community of former Death Eaters who had been cleared or who had avoided prosecution began shifting in their conversations, their postures, the way they talked about what had happened and what might happen next. Snape tracked all of this and reported to Dumbledore with the careful specificity of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know what mattered and what could be disregarded. He was ready when Voldemort came back. He had been ready for 13 years. The classroom Snape created in the Hogwarts dungeons over the course of his first years as a professor was specific in ways that went past personal preference. It was cold. This was partly inherent to underground rooms in a Scottish castle, and partly a choice. Snape made no effort to warm the space. Students sat in chill that their cloaks reduced but did not eliminate, which produced a quality of attentiveness in some students and discomfort in others, and attentiveness was the quality Snape was interested in producing. The walls were lined with preserved ingredients in sealed glass containers, pickled things of various colors, dried things of various textures, substances that moved when you looked at them too directly. The effect was meant to communicate that this was a professional environment, that the ingredients they were learning to work with were real things, with real properties, that would behave in ways the curriculum described, and not in ways the students preferred. He moved through the classroom without warmth. He corrected errors with precision that felt like contempt even when it was technically neutral. He failed students whose work failed to meet standards and did not soften this by telling them they had worked hard. Working hard was not the point. Getting it right was the point. Potions that were wrong did not become right because the person who made them had tried sincerely. This approach produced extremely good students and extremely frightened students, sometimes in the same person. Hermione Granger, who was technically exceptional, found Snape's classroom the only space at Hogwarts where she was not able to perform confidence. Harry Potter failed to distinguish himself in a subject where, as he would eventually discover, he was actually capable of doing excellent work when he had access to someone's marginalia telling him how. What Snape was doing in the classroom, beneath the methodology, was not teaching students to fear failure. He was teaching them that precision mattered, because precision actually mattered in this specific subject, that a potion brewed incorrectly was not the same kind of failure as an essay composed incorrectly. The consequences were different in kind. He knew this from the years he had spent studying and practicing at a level that went well past what any curriculum required. He was also maintaining a performance. Every year of excessive harshness toward Gryffindors, every year of inconsistency in his treatment of Slytherin students, every year of the particular intensity of his treatment of Harry Potter was contributing to a picture that needed to remain consistent. Former Death Eaters who visited Hogwarts for various reasons, parents who spoke to their children and had their children's accounts relayed to the communities that mattered, observed Snape behaving exactly as a man with his history and his current loyalties was expected to behave. The classroom was a stage. The professor who moved through it was a character. Beneath the character, in the back of the room, watching the students work, and occasionally, watching the corridor outside through the crack of the door, was the other thing, the man who was waiting for something he knew was coming, and was trying to keep everything in place until it arrived. He taught potions for 17 years. For 17 years he stood in the cold room, in the dungeons, with the preserved ingredients on the walls, and the students who feared him, and the performance that kept him credible to the people he needed to be credible to, and somewhere in the back of everything was the silver dough, undiminished, permanent, always. Toward the end of Harry's time at Hogwarts, before Snape's cover was broken on the astronomy tower, there is a scene that encapsulates the nature of what Snape's protection of Harry had been for 6 years. During Harry's 6th year, on the Hogwarts grounds, Draco Malfoy and his associates cornered Harry and attempted to use a curse on him. Snape appeared in the confrontation and stopped it. He did not stop it by defending Harry overtly, which would have been inexplicable given every established quality of his performance. He stopped it through the particular administrative authority of a senior staff member breaking up a conflict between students that had escalated past what was appropriate, which was the cover that made the intervention legible to everyone present in terms that did not require explanation. Harry did not register this as protection. Harry registered it as Snape doing what Snape technically should have been doing as a teacher, which was preventing serious harm to a student, for reasons that probably had more to do with the school's liability than with any interest in Harry's welfare. This was always the nature of the protection. It ran inside mechanisms that had other explanations available. The counter-curse at the Quidditch match appeared to be a hex. The administrative rerouting of students during the Death Eater headmastership appeared to be bureaucratic procedure. The detention Harry served in Snape's office in 6th year, during which Harry was close enough to Snape's monitoring systems to be visible to Snape rather than exposed to whatever else might have been happening, appeared to be punishment. None of it appeared to be love. That was the specific requirement of all of it. Love, in the form that Snape was expressing it, could not appear to be love. It had to look like calculation, or professional duty, or self-interest, or anything else that fit the character of the man performing the version of himself that kept the position intact. The students who were in Hogwarts with Harry during those years, and who experienced Snape as unfair, as cruel, as someone who had no interest in their welfare and considerable interest in their suffering, they were right about what they experienced. They were wrong, without any fault of their own, about what it meant. The experience was real, the meaning was different. This is one of the harder things to sit with in the full account. The students who found Snape's classroom a source of genuine distress were not being irrational. Their experience was accurate. They were in a room with someone who was treating them in ways that genuinely hurt, for reasons they could not access, and that would not have been comprehensible to them, even if they could have accessed them. Snape chose this because it was what the work required, and because there was no alternative available that served all the purposes simultaneously. He chose it knowing what it cost. He was not unaware, he was not indifferent. He was running the specific arithmetic of what was necessary versus what was ideal, and arriving, consistently, at the conclusion that the necessary and the ideal were not compatible, and that the necessary had to win. Harry survived. That was the measurement Snape applied to every year's work. We are close now to the end of this story, dear listener. If you have been here all night, if you started when the house was quiet, and you are still with us now, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Leave the words, "the double life," so we know how far you came tonight. And if you are new to the channel and you would like more stories like this one, please subscribe and turn on notifications. New Law for Sleep videos go up every week. There is a great deal more Wizarding World still to tell. The final meditations on Severus Snape begin now. In the autumn of 1991, after the sorting feast, and after Harry had been assigned his courses, and after the first week of school had established certain dynamics in certain classrooms, Snape did something he did not do habitually. He sat alone in his office for a long time after dinner, without doing anything productive. He had been waiting for Harry Potter's arrival since 1981. 10 years of waiting, 10 years of the particular patience required to hold a position intact for a purpose not yet arrived at. 10 years of teaching students who were not the student he was waiting for. He had been, in that decade, as prepared as preparation is possible to be for the thing he was waiting for. He had not been prepared for what it would feel like. Looking at Harry Potter across the Great Hall during the sorting was a different experience from having anticipated looking at Harry Potter across the Great Hall during the sorting. The anticipation did not contain the actual quality of the moment. The moment contained Lily's eyes in James Potter's face, and no amount of preparation absorbed the specific sensory fact of that. The way it arrived, not as a thought, but as a physical event, the recognition happening in the body before the mind could contextualize it. He sat in his office for a long time that night. Then he began the work of those 7 years, from Harry's arrival to the night on the astronomy tower, was the most sustained performance of Snape's life, which is a significant statement given the sustained quality of everything preceding it. He had to be, in the same room as Harry Potter, the person that Harry Potter needed him to be, for the cover to function, which was a cruel and unfair professor, with historical ties to dark magic, and no evident warmth for any student who was not from Slytherin. He had to do this every day, in every class, at every meal, in every corridor encounter, for 7 years running. The emotional cost of this was specific and real, and is never fully acknowledged in the account of what Snape did, because the account of what Snape did focuses understandably on what he did, rather than on what it cost him to do it. Every year, Harry Potter came back to Hogwarts in September, was a year during which Snape had to greet the arrival of Lily's eyes in James Potter's face with a performance of complete indifference. He had to sit at the staff table and watch Harry develop the qualities Lily had possessed and express them in ways that were sometimes recognizably hers and sometimes unmistakably his father's, and he had to register this without expression. He had to watch Harry make mistakes he could not correct, because correcting them would have compromised the character he was playing. He had to watch Harry form conclusions about him that were wrong at the level of interpretation and accurate at the level of experience, and he could not do anything about the gap between those two levels. He watched Harry nearly die multiple times in those 7 years, and had to respond to each near death with the calibrated reaction of someone who was not personally invested in the outcome. Not too little response, which would have been suspicious in a different way. Not too much response. The precise amount of professional concern that a difficult but not entirely indifferent educator would display. He did this for 7 years. He also watched Harry grow. This is not something the narrative usually acknowledges, because the acknowledgement requires you to give Snape an inner life in the same moments when his outer behavior is unpleasant, and the human tendency is to prefer simpler accounting. But Snape watched Harry Potter grow from a thin 11-year-old with round glasses and an expression of nervous determination in the first potions class into the person who walked into the Forbidden Forest in May of 1998. He watched the specific development of a person who was simultaneously Lily's son and his own. He watched Harry inherit Lily's particular capacity for loyalty, the way she had stood by him across the house divide, long past the point where most people would have given up. He watched Harry inherit James's talent for Quidditch, and James's reflexive courage, and James's quality of belonging that attracted people toward him. He watched Harry develop his own thing, which was neither of his parents exactly, a specific quality of determination that was not the same as bravery, a willingness to carry things alone that was not isolation, a relationship to sacrifice that was not indifference to his own life but a genuine prioritization of other lives over it. He watched all of this from the position of the hostile professor who docked points and criticized technique and failed to be impressed. In his office, alone, after the fact, he noted it. The word always does not usually carry the weight Dumbledore and Snape loaded onto it in the conversation about the Patronus. In ordinary use, it means what it appears to mean, a continuous or habitual state. I always drink tea in the morning. She always arrives early. He always knew the answer. These are statements about consistency, about habit, about the reliable patterns of a person's behavior over time. When Snape said always, in response to Dumbledore's question about the Patronus, the word was doing something more specific than that. It was answering a question about the relationship between time and feeling. The question underneath Dumbledore's question was whether the grief and the love had survived the decades since Lily's death in the form they had existed in when the death occurred, or whether they had transformed into something else, memory, abstraction, a structural habit that had taken the place of feeling without being feeling. The Patronus answered the question before Snape did. A Patronus cannot be maintained by historical feeling. It requires the feeling to be present, active, available. The silver dough that emerged from Snape's wand in Dumbledore's office had not changed its form in 10 years, because the feeling it was made from had not changed in 10 years. The love for Lily Evans was not a thing Snape had felt and preserved in amber, and was now carrying with him in a form that could be described accurately as memory. It was a thing he still felt, in the present tense, which is a different claim. This is the thing that is hardest to account for in the ordinary human experience of grief. Grief is supposed to change over time. The conventional understanding of how loss works includes a progression through stages and a gradual transformation of acute grief into something more manageable, and eventually into something like the peaceful memory of a person who was loved. The person who was lost becomes, over time, someone you carry gently rather than someone you are still in the process of losing. Snape did not process Lily's death in this way. The reasons are not mysterious. The guilt that compounded the grief, the fact that her death was not something that had happened to him, but something he had contributed to through a chain of choices that could be traced back to his own actions. The fact that her son arrived at Hogwarts 10 years later with her eyes. The fact that the work he was doing every day was the specific work of making her death mean something. You cannot grieve in stages when the grief has a job. So it stayed in the form it was in when it arrived, and the Patronus took the shape it took. And when Dumbledore asked, after all this time, the answer was the only honest answer available. The love for Lily Evans in 1991 was the same love as the love for Lily Evans in 1975, standing beside a river in Cokeworth, watching a girl make leaves rise from the ground in slow spirals around her feet. Different in what it could do with itself, different in what it was pointed at, the same in what it was. Always. The relationship between Albus Dumbledore and Severus Snape is one of the most asymmetrical in the series, and the asymmetry is not the obvious one. The obvious reading places Dumbledore in the position of power and Snape in the position of the instrument, the old headmaster who understood everything and the younger man who was used by that understanding. This reading is not wrong. Dumbledore did use Snape. He used Snape's grief and his guilt and his love and his desire to make something out of what had happened, and he used them with clarity of purpose and without full disclosure of everything he knew or intended. He kept from Snape, for years, the most significant piece of information about the plan, that Harry would have to die. He kept it because he needed Snape to maintain a relationship with Harry that served the larger plan, and he understood, with the precision that characterized all of Dumbledore's understandings, that Snape, knowing Harry was going to die, would change the quality of Snape's relationship to Harry in ways that might be visible. This is a form of manipulation. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. At the same time, Dumbledore's relationship to Snape was not simply instrumental, and the evidence for this is in the specific texture of what he offered Snape that no one else did. He offered Snape a purpose when Snape had destroyed the thing that had previously given him one. He offered him a role in which his particular capacities, the intelligence and the dark arts knowledge, and the endurance and the performance ability that had developed out of a childhood spent in a difficult house, in a difficult town, were not liabilities, but assets. He offered him the truth about what Snape was, and what Snape had done, and what Snape could still do about it, told plainly, and without false comfort, which was the one form of honesty Snape could actually use. He also trusted him, completely and consistently, in ways that were not always safe, and were always costly. He trusted Snape with information that, if Snape had been what he appeared to be, would have been catastrophic in Voldemort's hands. He trusted Snape to kill him when the time came, which required not just trusting Snape's capability, but trusting Snape's character, his understanding of what the killing would accomplish, and his willingness to carry the weight of being the one who did it. He trusted Snape to tell Harry, at the right moment, the thing Harry needed to know to do what the plan required. That is a great deal to trust to one person. The relationship between them was therefore not simply the relationship of a headmaster and his instrument. It was something closer to the relationship between two people who need each other for specific reasons, and who have arrived, over the course of many years, at something that resembles mutual understanding across a significant difference in knowledge and power. Dumbledore understood Snape. He understood him in the way that the most perceptive people understand the people around them, not by being told everything, but by observing over time and allowing the observation to accumulate into a complete picture. He knew about the love for Lily, and the guilt about the prophecy, and the need for purpose, and the capacity for endurance that had been built by the specific circumstances of Snape's formation. He knew all of this without Snape having fully explained it, which is the particular quality of being understood by someone who is paying attention. Snape, for his part, understood Dumbledore's methods without necessarily endorsing them. He understood that Dumbledore operated at a level of strategic remove that required accepting costs that were personal and specific, in service of outcomes that were abstract and general. He understood that this was how Dumbledore had always worked, and that the plan they were executing together was a product of this way of working. He did not always like it. The conversation about Harry being a Horcrux was the moment when the distance between Dumbledore's strategic clarity and Snape's personal investment became most visible, when Snape named what Dumbledore was doing in terms that were accurate and that Dumbledore could not argue with. He went on with it anyway, because the outcome required it, because Lily's son required it, because the love that had organized the last 17 years of his life pointed in the direction of the outcome, and the direction of the outcome was the direction Snape was going to move in, regardless of what it cost him. This is, in the end, the shape of the relationship between them, two people who used each other with honesty about the using, and who trusted each other through a series of years and choices that would have broken a trust built on smaller foundations. The portrait of Dumbledore in the headmaster's office watched Snape move through the year of the Death Eater headmastership with the specific quality of attention that oil paint on canvas can achieve when the intelligence behind it is still working. He watched what Snape was doing, and he offered what guidance he could, and he saw what the work was costing, and he continued because the plan required it. He is still in the office. The portrait does not age or change. Dumbledore, in that form, will watch every headmaster who comes after him for as long as the portrait survives, which is likely to be a very long time. He watched Snape. Snape did not have the comfort of a portrait. He had the present tense, which is what most people get, and the present tense of his final year at Hogwarts was the Shrieking Shack and Nagini and Harry Potter's face in the last light available to him. It was enough. He had done what he came to do. Hogwarts' school of witchcraft and wizardry is very old, and old magical buildings accumulate something that is not quite consciousness and is not quite indifference, but is somewhere between the two. The castle has watched a great many people move through its corridors over 1,000 years of use. It has watched people arrive young and leave less young, and carry what they learned here into the world, and come back sometimes in ways it did not expect. It has watched people make the wrong choices in its classrooms, and the right choices in the corridors between them. It has watched love and friendship and cruelty and loyalty and cowardice and extraordinary courage in the same rooms, often in the same people, often in the same hour. Severus Snape spent 26 years in the castle, 7 as a student, 1 as something less clear in the summer after 6th year, when he was taking the mark, 17 as a professor, and then 1 as headmaster. He is in the portrait now, in the gallery in the headmaster's office, in the company of all the headmasters before him. He sits in the painted version of his chair, with the painted version of his expression, controlled, watchful, the quality of assessment that characterized every room he ever occupied. The students who passed through the office over the years, following the end of the war, will look at the portrait and see what they see, which depends on what they bring to the looking. The students who know the story will see one thing. The students who know it only in outline will see another. The ones who know nothing, except that there was a headmaster named Snape who served during the worst year the school has known, will read the portrait according to the context they have for it. What the portrait contains, if portraits contain anything beyond the skills and habits of the person who sat for them, is a man who moved through the castle for 26 years, with something in him that almost no one who passed him in the corridor would have identified as love, and that was love, and that love was what the castle stood on at its most precarious moment. The silver dough is not in the portrait. Patronuses do not transfer to paint, but somewhere in the quality of the light the painter chose for the eyes, or in the particular way the hands sit in the image, or in something less articulable than either of these, the person who carried the dough for 17 years is present. The castle remembers everyone who moved through it. It remembers the boy from Spinner's End, who arrived in the autumn of 1971, with more knowledge of magic than most of his year, and almost no knowledge of how to exist among other people without being hurt. It remembers the professor who spent 17 years in the dungeons with his grief and his performance, and his slow accumulation of reasons to continue. It remembers the headmaster who ran interference on an administration designed to destroy young people, while being that administration's visible face. It remembers the silver Patronus that moved through the headmaster's office on the night Dumbledore asked his question, and received his answer. The castle is very old. It has a long memory. It will hold Severus Snape in it, the way it holds everyone who stayed long enough, and chose carefully enough, and loved something inside its walls that was worth loving. The candles in the great hall have burned low tonight, dear listener. The towers are quiet. The lake is still. The mountains beyond the school are dark against a sky that has more stars in it than most places can see. Sleep now. The story is told.